Far out in the open ocean, a crew of fishermen is carrying out a routine trip when disaster strikes without warning. Beneath the waves, an enormous mosasaurus suddenly bursts upward. The gigantic marine predator crashes into their vessel and devours it in a single violent attack. Thrown into the water, the terrified fishermen are left struggling for survival as the creature disappears back into the depths. 4 years have passed since the catastrophic eruption of the dormant volcano on Isla Nublar. Despite all that time, humanity still hasn't figured out how to live alongside dinosaurs without conflict. Around the world, tensions continue to grow as these prehistoric animals roam beyond the islands they once inhabited. Seeking to advance scientific understanding of dinosaurs, Lewis Dodgson, the head of the powerful biotechnology corporation Biosyn Genetics, has established a massive sanctuary hidden within Italy's Dolomite Mountains. However, Biosyn is surrounded by controversy. Rumors persist that scientists associated with the company secretly created a cloned human girl. Following the destruction of Jurassic World, that girl vanished without a trace and has since become the target of a worldwide search. The young girl is Macy Lockwood, whose genetic makeup is identical to Charlotte Lockwood, the late daughter of Benjamin Lockwood, one of the original founders of Jurassic Park. Elsewhere, Claire Deering has dedicated her life to protecting dinosaurs from exploitation. Once connected to Isla Nublar, she now works to rescue animals being sold through illegal trafficking operations. Accompanied by her colleague, she infiltrates a hidden breeding facility where dinosaurs are being held in terrible conditions. They secretly document everything they find, gathering evidence against those responsible. Inside the warehouse, they discover a young Triceratops separated from the others. After examining it, Zia realizes the animal is in critical condition and may not survive much longer. Claire understands that filing a report won't save it in time. Government intervention could take days, and the dinosaur doesn't have days left. Determined to act immediately, Claire decides to rescue the animal herself. The team drags the cage outside and contacts Franklin for assistance. Together, they work to load the weakened Triceratops into a waiting van. Before they can escape, the smugglers spot them and move in to stop them. Claire jumps behind the wheel and speeds away. Two pickup trucks quickly begin pursuing them. During the frantic chase, Claire drives directly into a herd of Triceratops, hoping the dinosaurs will create enough chaos to slow their pursuers. The gamble pays off. The massive animals unintentionally take care of the smugglers' vehicles, allowing the rescue team to escape safely with the young dinosaur. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Nevada, Owen Grady is busy relocating a herd of Parasaurolophus to a safer area. During the operation, one dinosaur becomes separated from the group. Using a rope, Owen skillfully lassos the animal and secures it to a sturdy tree. Rather than forcing it, he patiently earns the dinosaur's trust. After calming it down, he successfully guides it back toward the rest of the herd. Because she remains the subject of an international search, Macy Lockwood now lives in seclusion among the mountains. Life in hiding has become routine, but she often sneaks away on bicycle rides through nearby towns despite the risks involved. Following her grandfather's death, Claire took responsibility for raising her. Believing that secrecy is the only way to protect Macy, she keeps the teenager hidden from the outside world. But Macy struggles with that reality. Her adventurous nature constantly pushes against the restrictions placed on her life. The fact that she is a clone weighs heavily on her mind. Sometimes she feels as though she is merely a copy of someone else. Claire reassures her that her origin doesn't define her worth. No matter how she came into existence, she is still unique and important. Not long afterward, Owen returns home and joins his unusual family. After greeting him, Claire explains that Macy has once again ventured into town on her own. The couple realizes an uncomfortable truth: they won't be able to keep her isolated forever. A short distance from the cabin, Blue has built a life of her own. The intelligent velociraptor now has a young offspring named Beta, who is genetically identical to her mother. Blue attempts to teach the youngster how to hunt, but their lesson is interrupted when a wolf suddenly appears and snatches away the rabbit they were tracking. Later that evening, while everyone settles around a campfire, a man named Rain Delacourt contacts his employer. He reports that he successfully followed Owen to the remote cabin. Not only has he located the cloned girl everyone has been searching for, but he has also discovered Blue and her offspring. At the same time, on a farm in Texas, two children are caring for their family's chickens when they notice an unusually large insect clinging to a wooden fence. Moments later, the situation turns terrifying. A massive swarm of giant locusts erupts across the fields. The insects move like a living storm, consuming everything in their path. Crops vanish within moments. Panicked, the children sprint toward a nearby barn and lock themselves inside, hoping the structure will shield them from the relentless swarm until it finally passes. The following day, paleobotanist Ellie Sattler arrives to investigate the disaster. As she examines the damaged farmland, she learns that more than 60 different crop sites have already suffered similar attacks. Something about the situation doesn't add up. While most farms have been devastated, one neighboring field remains completely untouched. Digging deeper, Ellie discovers a critical difference. The unaffected farm uses seeds supplied by Biosyn. The discovery immediately raises suspicions. Ellie begins to suspect that Biosyn may have engineered these mutated locusts themselves, potentially creating a crisis that would force farmers to depend on the company's products. Determined to uncover the truth, she travels to Utah to seek help from someone she trusts. That person is Alan Grant. Now an accomplished paleontologist, Alan is fascinated when Ellie shows him one of the enormous insects. Yet the implications quickly overshadow the scientific curiosity. Ellie warns him that if these creatures continue reproducing at their current rate, widespread famine could become inevitable. Convinced that Biosyn is somehow responsible, she asks Alan to join her investigation and help gather evidence that could expose the corporation. Back at the cabin, Macy notices Beta for the first time and cautiously approaches the young dinosaur. Almost immediately, Blue appears nearby. Owen quickly instructs Macy to stay perfectly still. He carefully approaches Blue himself, maintaining the fragile trust they have built over the years. Once the situation calms down, he sends Macy back toward the cabin, but the rebellious teenager is frustrated. Ignoring the warning, she grabs her bicycle and heads off on another ride. What she doesn't realize is that she is being watched. Rain Delacourt is tracking her every move. The moment Macy leaves, he contacts his associates and provides them with her location. At nearly the same time, another group of hunters moves against Blue and Beta. They successfully capture Beta, while Blue desperately tries to intervene. During the struggle, she is knocked from a cliff and disappears below, leaving her fate uncertain as the kidnappers escape with her daughter. Blue's agonized cries echo through the mountains as Owen watches helplessly. Despite his efforts, there's nothing he can do to stop the kidnappers from escaping with Beta. The young velociraptor is gone, and Blue is left devastated. At the same time, Macy is riding across a bridge, unaware that danger is closing in around her. Within moments, several criminals surround her and cut off every possible escape route. Before she can react, she's taken captive. From a distance, Owen witnesses the abduction unfold. Realizing he's too late to intervene, he rushes back to the cabin and tells Claire what has happened. Furious and desperate, Owen immediately grabs his rifle, prepared to hunt down whoever took Macy. Before he leaves, Blue appears. The intelligent dinosaur is clearly distressed over the loss of her offspring. Owen looks at her and makes a promise. He vows that he will bring Beta back. Searching for answers, Claire contacts Franklin and asks him to track down the people responsible. Using his connections, Franklin identifies the hunter involved in the kidnapping operation. He explains that some agents working with law enforcement have infiltrated the criminal network and may be able to provide information on Rain Delacourt's location. Meanwhile, Ellie Sattler and Alan Grant arrive at Biosyn's massive sanctuary hidden within the Italian mountains. Upon their arrival, they are greeted by Ramsay Cole, Lewis Dodgson's trusted assistant. Ramsay escorts them through the enormous facility and eventually brings them to Biosyn's headquarters, where they finally meet Dodgson himself. The Biosyn CEO offers only a brief welcome. Claiming that his schedule is packed, he leaves Ramsay in charge of showing the visitors around the complex. During the tour, they stop at a lecture hall where a familiar face is addressing a room full of students. The speaker is Ian Malcolm. Still known for his brilliant work in chaos theory, Malcolm finishes his presentation before joining Ellie and Alan privately. While they wait for drinks, Ian reveals what he has secretly discovered. Biosyn is connected to the Locust Crisis. Knowing that evidence is hidden somewhere inside the facility, Malcolm discreetly hands Ellie a keycard. He explains that the answers they're looking for can be found inside a restricted area known as Basement 6, where the giant insects are being kept. Elsewhere inside Biosyn, Dr. Henry Wu meets with Dodgson to discuss a growing problem. The genetically engineered locusts are rapidly evolving. According to Wu, the creatures are reproducing faster than expected and becoming increasingly difficult to control. He insists that all of the insects released into the wild must be destroyed before the situation spirals further out of control. Dodgson immediately rejects the idea. Taking such action would raise questions and potentially expose Biosyn's involvement. Rather than fixing the problem, he chooses to protect the company's reputation. To reassure Wu, Dodgson shares some encouraging news. Both Macy Lockwood and Beta have been located. With access to their genetic material, Wu believes he may be able to correct the mistake that created the locust disaster in the first place. Not far away, pilot Kayla Watts receives payment after successfully transporting Beta. As she prepares to leave, she notices Macy nearby. It doesn't take long for Kayla to realize that something is wrong. The girl is clearly not there willingly. Even so, Kayla decides not to interfere. Getting involved with dangerous smugglers could easily cost her everything. Meanwhile, Claire and Owen have arrived in Italy. They reunite with Bari, their former colleague, who helps guide them deeper into the criminal underworld. Their search eventually leads them to an underground dinosaur market where prehistoric creatures are treated as entertainment and tools for profit. Inside the hidden operation, dinosaurs are forced into brutal fights while others are used for heavy labor. The entire place is a nightmare. When Claire encounters Kayla, she quickly notices that the pilot is American. Hoping to gain information, Claire asks her directly about Macy's whereabouts. Kayla refuses. Helping them would place a target on her back, and she has no intention of risking her life. Elsewhere in the market, Siona Santos oversees the latest shipment. The criminal leader congratulates her associates for successfully capturing both Macy and Beta alive. Their next task involves transporting a new and extremely dangerous cargo, several Atrociraptors. Unlike ordinary predators, these dinosaurs have been specially trained to hunt and kill anyone designated by their handlers. As the smugglers exchange money and finalize deals, undercover agents suddenly move in to make arrests. Chaos erupts. Rain and Siona immediately attempt to flee the scene. Determined to learn where Macy has been taken, Owen focuses entirely on Rain. While law enforcement clashes with the smugglers, Owen chases his target through the crowded marketplace. To create an opening for his escape, Rain overturns the transport vehicle carrying the Atrociraptors. The cages burst open. Two of the predators are released instantly. The dinosaurs charge straight at Owen, but years of experience allow him to evade them. Eventually, he catches up to Rain, and the two engage in a fierce hand-to-hand fight. During the struggle, Rain is knocked to the ground. Before he can recover, two hungry dinosaurs descend on him. With his arms trapped and his escape impossible, Rain suddenly finds himself at Owen's mercy. Owen demands answers. Terrified, Rain reveals everything he knows. He confirms that Siona took possession of Macy and claims he has no information about what happened afterward. That's all Owen needs. Leaving Rain to face the consequences of his actions, he departs while the dinosaurs close in around the helpless smuggler. At the same time, Siona finds herself cornered by authorities. Without hesitation, she activates the Atrociraptor's targeting system. Using a laser device, she marks several officers as prey. Instantly, the predators begin hunting. Panic spreads through the streets as everyone scrambles for safety. Claire spots an opportunity and grabs one of the electronic devices used to control the dinosaurs. She attacks Siona, and a brutal fight breaks out between them. After a hard struggle, Claire finally gains the upper hand. Before escaping, she learns a crucial piece of information. Macy has been transported to Biosin's sanctuary, but there is no time to celebrate. One of the Atrociraptors suddenly appears nearby. In a desperate move, Siona shines the targeting laser directly onto Claire. The dinosaur immediately locks onto its new prey. Claire takes off running. The predator tears after her through narrow streets and crowded passageways. Racing down staircases at terrifying speed, the dinosaur closes the gap with every second. With nowhere else to go, Claire makes a desperate leap across a gap between two buildings. It's a dangerous gamble, but it keeps her alive. Watching the chase unfold, Kayla finally decides to get involved. As Claire loses her footing and crashes into the back of a moving truck, Kayla rushes to help. She climbs into the vehicle and speeds away before the dinosaur can reach them. Elsewhere, Bari finds himself trapped and moments away from being torn apart. Just when things seem hopeless, Owen arrives. Together, they outmaneuver the predator. Bari deliberately lures the creature toward a nearby enclosure, and at precisely the right moment Owen slams the gate shut. The dinosaur is trapped. With the immediate threat neutralized, Bari formally announces Siona's arrest. Moments later, Owen receives a call from Claire. The conversation confirms what they've been searching for all along. Macy is being held at Biosin. Without wasting another second, Owen heads off to find her. Unfortunately, Siona isn't finished causing problems. Before being taken away, she activates the targeting laser once more and directs it at Owen. Two Atrociraptors immediately begin pursuing him. Meanwhile, another predator continues chasing the truck carrying Claire and Kayla. As they race through the city streets, the dinosaur relentlessly attacks the vehicle. At the last possible moment, Claire grabs a metal rod and uses it to strike the creature, finally forcing it away and ending the deadly pursuit. As Owen races through the chaos unleashed in the city, he witnesses scenes of absolute destruction. Massive dinosaurs are rampaging through the streets, and helpless civilians are caught in their path. People run in every direction, but many aren't fast enough. Although Owen wants to help, he can barely keep himself alive while being hunted by deadly predators. Meanwhile, Claire and Kayla have successfully reached the aircraft. Moments later, Owen arrives at the runway just as the plane is preparing to depart. At Claire's urging, Kayla opens the rear cargo compartment to give him a chance. Timing his approach perfectly, Owen launches himself toward the moving aircraft and grabs hold before it can gain too much speed. One of the pursuing Atrociraptors nearly catches him. The predator leaps into the open compartment and comes dangerously close to reaching him. But just as the aircraft lifts into the sky, the dinosaur loses its footing. It tumbles backward out of the cargo bay and plunges into the ocean below, dragging Owen's motorcycle down with it. With the immediate threat finally behind them, the three begin their journey toward Biocin's sanctuary, hidden deep within the Italian mountains. Back at the facility, Ramsay Cole informs Ellie and Alan that they have only 30 minutes to explore before meeting him later at the Hyperloop train station. Elsewhere in the complex, Dr. Henry Wu sits down with Macy and begins explaining why she is so important to his research. According to Wu, Blue carries genetic material derived from monitor lizards, reptiles capable of reproducing without requiring a mate. Because of this unique biological trait, Blue and Beta are genetically identical. Macy's situation is remarkably similar. Wu explains that Charlotte Lockwood, Macy's mother, achieved something extraordinary. Like Blue, Charlotte was able to create a child using only her own DNA. Macy listens as Wu reveals details she never knew. Charlotte was a brilliant scientist who deeply admired dinosaurs and dedicated much of her life to genetic research. However, after Macy was born, Charlotte developed a serious inherited illness. The disease eventually claimed her life. Before her death, though, she accomplished something incredible. Charlotte discovered a way to correct the genetic defect responsible for the condition. More importantly, she successfully altered every cell in Macy's body, ensuring her daughter would never suffer from the same disease. That achievement is exactly what fascinates Wu. If he can understand how Charlotte accomplished such a complex genetic modification, he may be able to apply similar techniques to the giant locusts threatening the world's food supply. At the same time, Ellie and Alan disguise themselves as Biocin employees and make their way into the restricted laboratory containing the engineered insects. Their objective is simple: obtain a DNA sample. By comparing the genetic material of these locusts with those devastating crops around the world, they hope to prove that Biocin is directly responsible for the crisis. Such evidence could expose the corporation and bring government intervention. While Wu is occupied in a meeting with Dodgson, Macy sees an opportunity. She quietly approaches Beta's enclosure and unlocks the cage. The young dinosaur immediately escapes. At the same moment, Macy makes a run for it as well. The escape triggers the facility's security systems, and alarms begin echoing throughout the laboratory. The loud noise agitates the giant locusts, causing them to swarm aggressively toward anyone nearby. Chaos spreads through the room. Macy and Beta manage to escape the insects, and shortly afterward they encounter Ellie and Alan. Realizing they all share a common goal, the four decide to flee the facility together. Meanwhile, Claire, Owen, and Kayla are closing in on Biocin's sanctuary when disaster strikes high above the mountains. A gigantic Quetzalcoatlus suddenly attacks the aircraft. The enormous flying reptile, one of the largest creatures ever to take to the skies during the late Cretaceous period, slams into the plane repeatedly. The damage quickly becomes catastrophic. The aircraft begins losing altitude. As the situation worsens, it becomes clear that only one seat is equipped with a parachute: Claire's. Knowing someone must reach Macy, Owen urges Claire to jump and continue the mission without him. Left with no alternative, she ejects from the failing aircraft. For a brief moment, it seems like she'll be safe. Then more pterosaurs appear. The flying predators descend upon her almost immediately. During the attack, her parachute canopy is shredded, sending her into another terrifying freefall. Fortunately, the emergency seat contains a backup parachute. Just in time, it deploys and slows her descent, allowing her to reach the ground alive. Back inside the sanctuary, Ellie and Alan arrive at the train station and finally learn the truth about Ramsay. Contrary to appearances, he has secretly been working against Dodgson. Ramsay reveals that he has been helping them all along and assists the group in escaping with the evidence they collected. Elsewhere in the wilderness surrounding the sanctuary, Claire finds herself suspended upside down from a tree, still trapped in the ejection seat. As she struggles to free herself, a massive Therizinosaurus wanders into the area. The enormous dinosaur has no idea she is there. Instead, its attention is focused on a nearby deer. Using its terrifyingly long claws, the creature attacks and kills the animal with brutal efficiency. Taking advantage of the distraction, Claire quietly escapes from the harness. She carefully crawls through the forest, trying to avoid drawing attention. When she realizes the dinosaur may be following her movements, she slips into a nearby lake and hides beneath the water's surface. Only after the threat appears to move away does she continue toward the facility. Meanwhile, despite the crash, Owen and Kayla survive. Their journey toward the sanctuary leads them across a frozen lake. To avoid falling through the ice, they move cautiously and try to distribute their weight as evenly as possible. Everything changes when a feathered predator appears. The dinosaur immediately targets them. Moments later, it dives beneath the ice and begins swimming through the freezing water below, tracking their movements from underneath. The pair break into a run. Cracks rapidly spread across the ice. Then disaster strikes. The surface gives way beneath Owen, plunging him into the icy lake. The predator rushes toward him and comes within seconds of making him its next meal. Kayla reacts instantly. She grabs Owen and pulls him free before the dinosaur can attack. The escape isn't over yet. The creature continues its pursuit, forcing them into another desperate sprint. Eventually, they reach a bridge connected to one of the sanctuary's access points. Spotting an elevator nearby, they rush inside. The doors close just in time, finally putting a barrier between themselves and the predator. Using the emergency tracking signal from Claire's ejection seat, Owen and Kayla locate her landing area. However, when they arrive, Claire is nowhere to be found. Instead, they witness another dramatic encounter. A Tyrannosaurus rex emerges and begins feeding on the deer left behind by the Therizinosaurus. The meal doesn't remain uncontested for long. A gigantic Giganotosaurus soon arrives and challenges the T-Rex for the carcass. Faced with a much larger opponent, the Tyrannosaurus retreats, surrendering the meal without a fight. Back inside Biosyn headquarters, Lewis Dodgson receives troubling news. One of the facility's security officers presents surveillance footage showing Ellie and Alan stealing genetic samples from the Locust laboratory. The evidence points toward an inside accomplice. Even more concerning, Dodgson begins to suspect that Ian Malcolm may have helped them. Determined to stop anyone from escaping with incriminating information, Dodgson immediately orders the transportation system shut down. The power supplying the Hyperloop train is disabled. With their planned escape route gone, Ellie, Alan, Macy, and Beta are forced to search for another way out of the sanctuary. Back inside Biosyn headquarters, Lewis Dodgson summons Ian Malcolm to his office. The conversation is brief and tense. Having discovered Ian's involvement in helping Ellie and Alan, Dodgson immediately terminates him from the company. Fortunately, Ramsay remains loyal to the group. With Ramsay's assistance, Ian quickly steals a transport vehicle and sets out to rescue his friends before security can stop him. Meanwhile, Alan, Ellie, Macy, and Beta continue searching for a way out of the sanctuary. Alan climbs a ladder in hopes of locating an alternate tunnel system that could lead them to safety. Instead, he finds himself face-to-face with another terrifying dinosaur. The creature forces the group to keep moving. Every route they take seems to lead directly into more danger. Before long, they encounter additional predators and are driven deeper into the facility. Eventually, they reach what appears to be a dead end. Their only hope is a massive metal security gate. Frantically, they attempt to open it, but the locking system refuses to cooperate. Just as panic begins to set in, Ian arrives. He immediately starts working on bypassing the security controls, trying different access codes while the predators close in. From elsewhere in the facility, Ramsay remotely accesses the system and successfully unlocks the gate. The entrance slides open at the last possible moment. Elsewhere, Claire continues making her way through the wilderness surrounding the sanctuary. Every step feels dangerous as dinosaurs roam freely throughout the forest. Suddenly, a Dilophosaurus appears. The predator slowly approaches, preparing to attack. Before Claire can react, Owen arrives alongside Kayla. Working together, they manage to drive the dinosaur away and reunite with Claire before any serious harm is done. At the same time, Dodgson becomes increasingly desperate to cover up Biosyn's crimes. Determined to erase evidence linking the company to the ecological disaster, he orders all of the engineered locusts destroyed. The containment systems are redirected toward the facility's incineration process. But the plan backfires spectacularly. As the insects come under attack, they enter a frenzy and overwhelm their enclosure. The containment chamber is destroyed, allowing thousands of giant locusts to escape. Moments later, the insects burst into the surrounding forest. Unfortunately, many of them are already on fire. The result is catastrophic. Flaming locusts spread throughout the valley, igniting vegetation everywhere they go and turning the sanctuary into a growing inferno. Meanwhile, Ian is driving the rescue vehicle when the burning swarm suddenly descends from the sky. The flaming insects strike the vehicle from all directions. Ian loses control and crashes. The transport rolls over violently before finally coming to a stop. Remarkably, everyone survives. Not long afterward, Owen and Claire locate the wreckage and are overwhelmed with relief when they discover Macy safe and unharmed. The reunion is short-lived. A Giganotosaurus suddenly emerges nearby. The gigantic predator immediately forces the group into another desperate escape. Everyone runs for cover while Ian chooses a different strategy. Rather than fleeing with the others, he remains behind and hides inside the overturned vehicle. The group eventually becomes trapped with nowhere left to run. Just when it seems impossible to escape, Ian steps forward. Holding a skewer with a flaming locust attached to it, he deliberately attracts the attention of the enormous predator. The Giganotosaurus turns toward him. As the dinosaur prepares to strike, Ian throws the burning insect directly into its mouth. The unexpected distraction buys enough time for everyone to rush inside the facility, but the predator isn't ready to give up. The Giganotosaurus slams into the structure and smashes through sections of glass in an attempt to reach them. The creature only retreats after Claire uses a stun device and blasts it directly in the eye. For the moment, the group is safe. Now they need a way to leave the sanctuary before the fires and dinosaurs make escape impossible. At that moment, Ramsay appears and offers his help. He informs them that a helicopter is available, giving everyone a chance to evacuate. Before heading to the extraction point, however, Owen remembers the promise he made. Beta is still missing. He refuses to leave without returning Blue's offspring. Ramsay warns him that the helicopter will depart in 10 minutes. Knowing time is running out, Owen heads off to find Beta. Alan and Macy volunteer to help. When they finally locate the young dinosaur, Macy distracts her while Owen carefully prepares a tranquilizer dart. The plan works. Beta is safely subdued, allowing them to transport her without injury. Meanwhile, the forest fire continues spreading across the sanctuary. The situation becomes so severe that Dodgson is forced to abandon the facility entirely. Desperate to escape, he boards the Hyperloop train. His relief doesn't last long. The power system fails, leaving the train stranded deep inside a tunnel. With no other option, Dodgson exits the vehicle and attempts to continue on foot. That decision proves fatal. A group of Dilophosaurus quickly finds him inside the dark passageway. The terrified businessman tries to flee, but there is nowhere to go. Moments later, the predators surround and kill him, bringing an end to the man responsible for so much destruction. After regrouping, the survivors encounter Dr. Henry Wu. For the first time, Wu openly admits responsibility for the ecological crisis. He explains that he needs access to Macy's unique genetic information if he hopes to correct the damage caused by the engineered locusts. After hearing his explanation, Macy agrees to help. With the facility collapsing around them, everyone rushes toward the evacuation point, where Kayla is already waiting with the helicopter. But before they can leave, one final obstacle stands in their way. The sanctuary's two largest predators cross paths. A massive confrontation begins. The Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Giganotosaurus engage in a brutal battle for dominance. As the giants clash, the humans are forced to dodge debris and stay out of the path of the combatants. The fight is vicious. For a time, the Giganotosaurus appears unstoppable and eventually overpowers the T-Rex, seemingly defeating it. Then another contender enters the battle. The Therizinosaurus arrives. Its enormous claws turn the confrontation into a three-way struggle. At the exact moment when all hope seems lost, the Tyrannosaurus rises once more. Joining forces, whether intentionally or not, with the Therizinosaurus, the two dinosaurs attack their common rival. The final exchange is devastating. The Giganotosaurus is driven backward and impaled by the Therizinosaurus' massive claws. The giant predator collapses, ending the battle once and for all. The following morning, authorities and news crews arrive at the sanctuary. As investigations begin, former Biosyn employees come forward and reveal the company's hidden crimes to the public. With the truth finally exposed, Biosyn's downfall becomes inevitable. For Ellie and Alan, the ordeal brings something positive as well. After years of missed opportunities and paths that continually separated them, the two finally acknowledge their feelings and begin a relationship together. Meanwhile, Owen, Claire, and Macy prepare to return home. Having survived the nightmare and rescued everyone they came for, they can finally move forward with peace of mind. In the weeks that follow, Henry Wu succeeds in developing a solution to the locust crisis. Using the knowledge gained from Macy's DNA, he manages to alter the insects genetically and prevent the ecological catastrophe from spreading further. the international community soon takes action. The United Nations officially designates the valley surrounding Biocin's former headquarters as a protected global sanctuary, ensuring dinosaurs can live there safely without interference from the outside world. Back home, Owen fulfills the promise he made from the very beginning. He reunites Beta with Blue. The emotional reunion allows mother and daughter to be together once again. Before disappearing back into the wild, Blue shares one final moment with Owen, silently acknowledging the bond they have built over the years. With that promise fulfilled, Owen returns to Claire and Macy. For the first time in a long while, their family is finally able to enjoy a peaceful future together. Before we even talk about the story, the dinosaurs, or any of the chaos that happens later, I think it's important to talk about the weight this movie was carrying before it ever reached theaters. Because Jurassic World Dominion wasn't just another sequel. This was being sold as the big one, the finale, the movie that would somehow bring together nearly 3 decades of Jurassic history into a single story. And honestly, that's a pretty powerful idea. For a lot of people, Jurassic Park isn't just another blockbuster. It's one of those movies that sits in a special place. Even now, years later, people still remember the first time they saw that giant Brachiosaurus step onto the screen. The sense of wonder, the music, the feeling that you were seeing something impossible brought to life. That movie left a mark. The sequels that followed have always had a more complicated reputation. Some fans enjoyed them, some didn't, but regardless of where you stand on any individual entry, the franchise never really disappeared. It kept finding ways to continue. Then Jurassic World arrived and introduced a whole new generation to the series. Different characters, bigger action, larger spectacle. Not everyone loved the direction it took, but it undeniably brought the franchise back into the spotlight. So when Dominion was announced, expectations were naturally huge, not just because it was another Jurassic movie, because it promised something fans had been talking about for years, the return of the original trio, Laura Dern, Sam Neill, Jeff Goldblum. Suddenly this wasn't only about Owen and Claire anymore. It felt like 2 different eras of the franchise were finally going to collide. For longtime fans, that alone was enough to create excitement. And I think that's where a lot of the anticipation came from. People weren't necessarily looking for the biggest dinosaur movie ever made. They were looking for a payoff, something that would connect everything that came before it and make this trilogy feel like a meaningful conclusion rather than just another chapter. The marketing leaned heavily into that idea too. Every trailer, every promotional image, every interview seemed to emphasize that this was the moment the entire Jurassic saga had been building toward. That's a dangerous promise to make. Because once you position a movie as the grand finale, people stop judging it as a regular sequel. The standards immediately change. Now audiences aren't asking, was this entertaining? They're asking, was this worth the journey? Did it justify bringing everyone back? Did it do something meaningful with the legacy of Jurassic Park? Did it earn the right to call itself the conclusion of this story? Those are much bigger questions, and whether Dominion succeeds or fails depends a lot on how you answer them. But one thing is undeniable. Very few movies arrive carrying this much nostalgia, this much expectation, and this much responsibility. Before the first dinosaur even appears on screen, Dominion is already trying to live up to nearly 30 years of audience memories. That's not an easy challenge for any blockbuster. One of the most interesting things about Dominion actually starts before the movie itself. It's the question that a lot of fans had after Fallen Kingdom ended. Remember that final scene? Dinosaurs escaping into the world, flying over cities, running across open landscapes. Humanity suddenly forced to share the planet with creatures that had no business being there in the first place. For me, that ending felt huge. Not because it answered anything, but because it didn't. It left the audience staring at a future filled with possibilities. How would governments react? What would happen to wildlife? Would dinosaurs become invasive species? Could people even adapt to living alongside them? The imagination immediately starts filling in the blanks. And honestly, there was a part of me that thought maybe that was enough. Maybe the most powerful thing the franchise could have done was stop right there. Leave us with that image. Let the audience debate the consequences forever. Instead, Dominion decides to continue the story and actually show us what happens next. Now, that's not automatically a bad idea. In fact, on paper, it sounds like exactly the movie fans had been waiting for. For decades, the franchise kept trapping dinosaurs on islands, in parks, behind fences, inside contained environments. Suddenly, those limitations were gone. The dinosaurs were free. The world itself had become Jurassic Park. That's a fascinating setup. The problem is that once you open that door, expectations immediately become enormous. People start imagining entire societies adapting to dinosaurs. New laws, new industries, new dangers, entire ecosystems changing, maybe even a completely different relationship between humans and nature. The possibilities are endless, which is why some viewers ended up feeling frustrated, not because the premise was bad, because the premise was so good. When you introduce an idea that big, people naturally want to spend time exploring it. They want to see how everyday life has changed. They want to see what this new world actually looks like. They want to feel the consequences of what happened at the end of the previous film. And that's where Dominion becomes a really interesting case. The movie acknowledges that dinosaurs are now everywhere. We see glimpses of it, news reports, incidents, encounters, evidence that the world has changed. But at the same time, the story doesn't fully stay focused on that concept. It starts there, then it gradually moves toward other priorities. For some people, that shift works perfectly fine. They see the dinosaur-filled world as a backdrop rather than the main attraction. For others, it feels like the film walks away from its most exciting idea, and I completely understand both perspectives. Because when Fallen Kingdom ended, it felt like the franchise had finally broken free from its old formula. The dinosaurs were no longer someone else's problem on a distant island. Now they were everyone's problem. That's a premise that almost sells itself, which is why, years later, one of the biggest conversations surrounding Dominion isn't necessarily what the movie does. It's what some people feel it could have done, not because the concept lacked potential, but because it might have had too much of it. The ending of Fallen Kingdom left audiences with a question that felt almost impossible to answer, and Dominion spends much of its runtime trying to answer it. Whether that answer feels satisfying or not is where opinions really begin to divide. For years, every Jurassic movie operated within a pretty simple framework. The dinosaurs were somewhere else, an island, a facility, a restricted zone. No matter how dangerous things became, there was always a clear boundary separating the prehistoric world from our own. Dominion starts by removing that boundary entirely, and honestly, that's what immediately grabbed my attention. For the first time in the franchise, dinosaurs aren't confined to a park. They aren't hidden away from civilization. They're just out there, living among us. The opening stages of the film spend time showing what that looks like. Dinosaurs wandering through snowy forests, dinosaurs interacting with modern wildlife, governments trying to regulate them, news reports treating dinosaur incidents as part of everyday life. It's a strange idea when you think about it. Humanity spent decades imagining what would happen if dinosaurs returned, and now the franchise is finally trying to visualize that reality. There are moments where the concept genuinely feels fresh. You start noticing how unusual the world has become. A dinosaur sighting is no longer a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's becoming another problem for authorities to deal with. Another headline, another conflict. And that's where the movie briefly feels different from everything that came before it, because the threat isn't isolated anymore. The world itself has changed. What's interesting is that the film doesn't present dinosaurs as some unstoppable apocalypse. Civilization hasn't collapsed. Humanity hasn't been driven into hiding. Society is still functioning. Instead, the movie presents a world attempting to adapt. Some people exploit dinosaurs, some protect them, some fear them, some profit from them, and that feels like a logical extension of what humans tend to do with anything valuable or dangerous. At its best, Dominion hints at a world filled with complicated relationships between people and these creatures, a world where dinosaurs are no longer mythical attractions, they're animals. Dangerous animals, certainly, but animals nonetheless. That shift in perspective is actually one of the more interesting ideas in the film. The dinosaurs aren't always treated as monsters. Sometimes they're treated as wildlife. Sometimes as property. Sometimes as victims of human greed. It's a subtle change, but it helps the franchise feel slightly more mature in places. At the same time, this premise creates a challenge. Once you show audiences a world transformed by dinosaurs, they naturally want to see more of it. Every glimpse of this new reality raises additional questions. How do cities function? How do ecosystems adapt? How do governments respond? What happens to farming, transportation, tourism, or public safety? The film occasionally touches on these ideas, but mostly through brief moments rather than deep exploration. And that's why the opening concept remains one of the most talked about aspects of Dominion, not because it's unsuccessful, but because it's fascinating. It's the kind of premise that instantly sparks curiosity. For a brief moment, it feels like the franchise is stepping into completely new territory. The fences are gone. The islands are behind us. The dinosaurs have inherited a place in the modern world. And whether the film fully capitalizes on that idea or not, it's still one of the most compelling starting points the series has introduced in years. If the previous films were all about bringing dinosaurs back, Dominion is supposed to be about what happens after that. And that's a very different question, because once dinosaurs are loose across the planet, the real challenge isn't creating them anymore. It's living with them. That's the idea hanging over almost every part of this movie. Can humans and dinosaurs actually coexist? It's a concept that sounds simple at first, but the more you think about it, the bigger it becomes. Throughout the film, there are little reminders that the world is trying to adjust. Dinosaurs are no longer rare attractions hidden behind fences. They're becoming part of everyday life. Some are protected, some are hunted, some are exploited, others are simply trying to survive. What's interesting is that the movie doesn't portray this new reality as complete chaos. Society hasn't collapsed. Humanity is still functioning. People are still going to work. Governments still exist, and life goes on. The difference is that there's now another group of creatures sharing the planet, and not just any creatures, massive predators, ancient species, animals that were never meant to exist alongside modern civilization. That's what makes the premise so fascinating. The film occasionally shows moments where dinosaurs resemble modern wildlife more than movie monsters. They're migrating, competing for territory, interacting with ecosystems, and creating challenges that humanity now has to manage. Those moments hint at a much larger story, a story about adaptation, because coexistence doesn't mean harmony, it means adjustment. It means learning how to function in a world that has fundamentally changed. And that's where some viewers found themselves wanting more. The idea itself is incredibly rich. You could build entire movies around the social, environmental, and political consequences of dinosaurs returning. The possibilities are almost endless. Instead, Dominion often treats coexistence as background context rather than the central focus. The concept is present, it's important, but it rarely becomes the driving force of the narrative. That's not necessarily a flaw, depending on what you expected going in. Some audiences were perfectly happy using it as a launching point for a more traditional adventure story. Others were hoping the movie would dive much deeper into the reality of this new world. And honestly, both reactions make sense, because the film keeps showing glimpses of a fascinating idea without always stopping long enough to fully explore it. You see enough to imagine how complicated this world has become, enough to realize that dinosaurs aren't simply invaders anymore. They're residents. They're part of the equation now. In a strange way, that's one of the most significant changes the franchise has ever made. The original Jurassic Park asked whether humanity should bring dinosaurs back. Dominion shifts the conversation. The dinosaurs are already here. Now the question is whether humans are capable of sharing the world with them. And even when the movie moves in other directions, that idea remains quietly sitting in the background, reminding us how much the world has changed since those park gates first opened all those years ago. One thing that becomes clear pretty quickly in Dominion is that the dinosaurs themselves aren't really the main villains. That role belongs to Biosyn, and honestly, that's a direction the franchise has flirted with for years. Ever since the original Jurassic Park, the real danger was never just the animals. It was the people who believed they could control them, the people convinced they were smarter than nature. The people who looked at an incredible scientific breakthrough and immediately started calculating profits. Biosyn is basically the latest version of that idea. In Dominion, the company sits at the center of almost everything. They're powerful, influential, technologically advanced, and publicly present themselves as a force for good. On the surface, they appear to be solving problems and helping manage a world now filled with dinosaurs. But as the story unfolds, it becomes obvious that there's much more happening beneath that image. What I found interesting is that Biosyn isn't operating from some secret volcano base or hidden laboratory. They're functioning like a legitimate corporation. They have resources, authority, public trust, and enough influence to shape events on a global scale. That makes them feel more relevant than a typical movie villain organization. At least in theory, because the film keeps returning to the idea that immense power, when combined with little accountability, creates dangerous consequences. Biosyn isn't just studying dinosaurs, they're controlling information. They're controlling research, they're controlling access. And in many ways, they're trying to control the future itself. That's where the company becomes important to the larger themes of the movie. The dinosaurs may grab the attention, but Biosyn represents something else entirely. Human ambition, corporate power, the belief that every problem can be solved, managed, packaged, and ultimately monetized. The film repeatedly suggests that humanity hasn't learned much from previous disasters. Instead of respecting the lessons of the past, people continue finding new ways to repeat them, and Biosyn becomes the embodiment of that cycle. What's interesting is that the company also serves as the point where nearly every major storyline eventually converges. The investigations surrounding the ecological crisis, the search for Macy, the involvement of the original Jurassic Park characters, the efforts of Owen and Claire, everything gradually points back toward Biosyn. In that sense, the corporation functions almost like the narrative hub of the entire movie. Whether viewers find it compelling or not is another discussion. Some may see Biosyn as a familiar corporate antagonist, following a path that feels recognizable from countless other blockbusters. Others may appreciate how naturally it fits into the franchise's long-running warnings about unchecked scientific ambition and commercial greed. Either way, Biosyn isn't just another company in the background. It's the engine driving much of the conflict. And in a film filled with giant predators, flying reptiles, and prehistoric chaos, Dominion ultimately suggests that the most dangerous force in the story isn't a dinosaur at all. It's the people who still believe they can control everything. If there's one idea that keeps surfacing throughout Dominion, it's that the dinosaurs are really just symptoms of a larger problem. The actual problem is what people choose to do with power, and that's where the film starts leaning heavily into its corporate greed storyline. At the center of all of this is the belief that scientific breakthroughs can become incredibly dangerous once profit enters the equation. Not because science itself is the problem, but because someone always sees an opportunity to make money from it. That's a theme the Jurassic franchise has carried from the very beginning. Back in the original film, the warning signs were already there. A revolutionary discovery was transformed into a commercial attraction before anyone truly understood the consequences. Dominion expands that idea to a much larger scale. Now we're no longer dealing with a theme park, we're dealing with global influence, corporate reach, the ability to affect entire populations. What makes the situation interesting is that the film repeatedly asks a simple question. What happens when an organization becomes powerful enough to shape the future according to its own interests? The answer isn't presented through speeches or philosophical debates. It's shown through actions, decisions made behind closed doors, research conducted without sufficient oversight, people becoming assets rather than individuals, nature becoming something to exploit rather than respect. The movie clearly views greed as a driving force behind many of the problems unfolding throughout the story. Not survival, not necessity, greed. The desire for more control, more influence, and more power. And that's where Dominion ties back into one of the franchise's oldest ideas. Humanity keeps making the same mistake. Every generation believes it can manage forces that previous generations failed to control. Every generation assumes it will succeed where others failed. And every generation ends up creating new disasters. The dinosaurs may be prehistoric, but the behavior surrounding them feels very modern. Companies competing for influence, people chasing profits, institutions placing ambition ahead of responsibility. Whether the film handles these ideas with complete subtlety is certainly debatable. In fact, some viewers may find the message extremely direct, but even so, it's impossible to miss what Dominion is trying to say. The danger isn't simply that humans created dinosaurs. The danger is that someone always sees an opportunity to benefit from that creation. And once enormous power becomes tied to enormous profit, good intentions tend to disappear very quickly. That's what makes this theme so important to the movie. Long after the dinosaur attacks end, the larger warning remains the same. Technology changes, scientific discoveries change, the creatures may even change, but human greed. That part stays remarkably consistent, and Dominion spends a lot of time reminding us that history often repeats itself when nobody learns from it. Now this is where Dominion becomes, let's just say, unexpected. Because if you walked into this movie expecting the central conflict to be about dinosaurs taking over the world, you're probably going to be surprised when you realize that a huge portion of the story is actually focused on giant genetically engineered locusts. And that's been one of the most divisive parts of the entire film, not because the locusts are unimportant to the plot. Quite the opposite, actually. They're at the center of almost everything that's happening. The investigation, the corporate conspiracy, the return of several legacy characters, so much of the movie revolves around these insects. The question is whether audiences wanted that. It's a strange situation, because the idea itself isn't completely disconnected from Jurassic Park's themes. The franchise has always been interested in genetic manipulation and the unintended consequences of scientific interference. In theory, giant engineered locusts fit right into that conversation, but in practice, it creates a very unusual experience. You're watching a Jurassic movie. You came for dinosaurs. The marketing was full of dinosaurs. The posters were full of dinosaurs. The trailers were full of dinosaurs. And then suddenly, the plot keeps steering back toward giant bugs destroying crops. that's where a lot of viewers started feeling disconnected. Not necessarily because the idea is bad, but because it feels like it belongs to a different movie, a science fiction thriller about ecological disaster, a corporate conspiracy film, maybe even something closer to a biotech thriller than a dinosaur adventure. What's fascinating is that the Locust storyline is actually trying to tackle some pretty big concerns: food security, agricultural control, environmental damage, the consequences of manipulating nature for profit. Those are legitimate themes. They're just not the themes many people expected to dominate the final chapter of a Jurassic trilogy. And that's what makes the reaction so mixed. Some viewers appreciated that the movie was attempting something different rather than simply repeating another run-from-dinosaur plot. Others felt the film drifted away from the very thing that makes the franchise special, because every minute spent discussing locusts is a minute not spent exploring the dinosaur-filled world that the previous film promised. Personally, I think the biggest issue isn't the existence of the locust plot, it's how much narrative weight it carries. The storyline isn't a side mission, it isn't background material, it's one of the primary engines driving the entire movie. That means your enjoyment of Dominion often depends on whether you're willing to go along with that premise. If the concept works for you, the film gains an additional layer of mystery and investigation. If it doesn't, it can feel like the movie keeps wandering away from its most interesting ideas. Either way, the giant locust crisis ends up becoming one of the defining features of Dominion, not the dinosaurs. Not the action sequences, not even the returning cast. The thing people discuss most often after watching this movie is usually the same question: how did the final chapter of the Jurassic World trilogy end up being so heavily focused on giant locusts? And honestly, that's probably the strongest indication of just how unusual this storyline really is. Beneath all the dinosaur chases, corporate conspiracies, and blockbuster spectacle, Dominion is actually trying to talk about something much bigger. Nature, not dinosaurs specifically, nature as a whole. One thing I noticed while watching the film is that it keeps returning to the same underlying idea: humanity has an incredible talent for disrupting systems it barely understands. That's been part of Jurassic Park's DNA since the beginning. The original film wasn't really about dinosaurs. It was about people believing they could control nature, only to discover that nature doesn't care about business plans, security systems, or human confidence. Dominion takes that concept and scales it up. Instead of focusing on a single park failure, it starts looking at global consequences: entire ecosystems, food chains, wildlife management, environmental balance. The movie repeatedly suggests that when humans interfere with natural processes, the effects don't stay contained for very long. One decision creates another problem. That problem creates another. And eventually, the consequences become too large to ignore. What's interesting is that the film doesn't just present dinosaurs as the environmental challenge. The dinosaurs are actually only one part of a much larger picture. Throughout the story, we see concerns about species disruption, ecological imbalance, and the ripple effects of introducing powerful new variables into an already fragile world. The message is fairly clear. Nature operates through balance. Once that balance is disturbed, restoring it becomes far more difficult than maintaining it in the first place. And while the movie delivers that message through giant prehistoric creatures and genetically engineered organisms, the underlying concern feels surprisingly familiar. It's not hard to see why these themes resonate. Questions about environmental responsibility, conservation, and humanity's relationship with the natural world have become increasingly relevant in real life as well. Dominion isn't particularly subtle about its concerns, but it doesn't completely hide them either. In many ways, the film views human arrogance as the source of ecological instability. People don't simply observe nature. They alter it, exploit it, commercialize it, then act surprised when the consequences arrive. That's a pattern the franchise has explored for decades, and Dominion continues that tradition even when its methods are sometimes debatable. What I found interesting is that the movie occasionally treats dinosaurs less like monsters and more like wildlife caught in circumstances created by humans. They're not always the villains. Sometimes they're victims of the same irresponsible decisions that threaten everyone else. That shift in perspective adds a different layer to the story. The conflict stops being humans versus dinosaurs. Instead, it becomes humans versus the consequences of their own actions. Whether Dominion fully develops these ideas is certainly open to debate. There are moments where the film seems eager to explore them, and other moments where action sequences take priority. But the themes are definitely there. Running quietly underneath, the explosions, escapes, and giant creatures is a recurring warning about ecological responsibility. the movie keeps asking a simple question. What happens when humanity refuses to respect the systems that keep the natural world in balance? And while Dominion may not always provide a perfect answer, it's one of the more interesting questions the film raises along the way. One thing that stood out to me while watching Dominion is how often the movie circles back to the same warning that has followed this franchise from day one. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. That idea has always been sitting at the heart of Jurassic Park. The dinosaurs were never the real issue. The issue was the decision to bring them back without fully understanding the consequences. And nearly 30 years later, Dominion is still wrestling with that same problem. The difference is that the scale has grown. We're no longer talking about one scientific breakthrough inside a secluded park. The technology has evolved, the experiments have expanded, and the consequences are now affecting the entire world. What's fascinating is that the film doesn't portray science itself as dangerous. In fact, science is responsible for many of the solutions as well. The problem arises when knowledge becomes separated from responsibility, when innovation moves faster than wisdom. When people become so focused on what is possible that they stop asking whether it is necessary. That's the line Dominion keeps exploring. Throughout the story, scientific achievements are treated almost like powerful tools. In the right hands, they can help people. In the wrong hands, they can create problems on a massive scale. And that's where the ethical questions begin. Who decides how these technologies are used? Who regulates them? Who is responsible when things go wrong? The movie repeatedly suggests that scientific progress without accountability can become incredibly dangerous, not because discovery is bad, but because human ambition often outruns human judgment. What makes this theme interesting is that it extends beyond dinosaurs. The film isn't only concerned with prehistoric creatures. It's concerned with genetic engineering, biological manipulation, and humanity's growing ability to reshape life itself. At several points, the story presents a world where science has become so advanced that the boundaries which once seemed impossible are now easily crossed. Species can be altered, DNA can be manipulated, entire biological systems can be changed. The technology exists. The question is whether the people using it are making responsible decisions. And that's where Dominion becomes less of a creature feature and more of a cautionary tale, because the movie's greatest fear isn't scientific progress. It's scientific progress operating without restraint, without oversight, without ethics, without anyone willing to ask difficult questions. One of the reasons this theme remains relevant is because it feels believable. The details may be exaggerated for blockbuster entertainment, but the underlying concern is recognizable. History is filled with examples of powerful innovations being adopted before society fully understood their consequences. Dominion takes that anxiety and amplifies it through the lens of genetic technology. Some viewers may find the message heavy-handed. Others may appreciate that the film attempts to engage with larger ideas beyond simple dinosaur attacks. Either way, the theme is impossible to miss. Because beneath all the action, the movie keeps returning to the same warning: knowledge is powerful, but power without responsibility has always been the fastest path to disaster. And in the Jurassic universe, nobody seems to learn that lesson for very long. For a movie packed with dinosaurs, giant corporations, and world-threatening crises, it's interesting how much of Dominion eventually revolves around one person. Macy Lockwood, and what makes her important isn't who she is, it's how she came into existence. When Dominion begins, Macy is no longer the child we saw in the previous film. She's older, more independent, and clearly frustrated by the life she's been forced to live. Owen and Claire are trying to protect her. The problem is that protection and freedom aren't always the same thing. From Macy's perspective, she's essentially growing up in isolation. She's constantly being watched, constantly being told what she can and can't do, and constantly reminded that there are people searching for her. It's understandable why she begins pushing back. What makes her storyline different from everyone else's is that she's not really fighting dinosaurs. She's trying to understand herself. And that becomes one of the more personal threads running through the movie. Because Macy isn't just another character caught in the middle of the chaos. She's living proof of how far genetic science has progressed in this universe. Her existence raises questions that the franchise hasn't fully explored before. Questions about identity, questions about creation, questions about whether biology determines who we are. Throughout the film, various groups are interested in Macy because of what her DNA represents. To them, she's valuable, important, useful. But from Macy's perspective, that attention creates a completely different problem. Imagine growing up knowing that people are more interested in your genetic makeup than your actual personality. knowing that others see you as research material before they see you as a human being. That's a difficult burden for any character to carry. And while Dominion is primarily an adventure film, there are moments where it quietly explores that emotional side of her situation. The search for Macy becomes more than a rescue mission. It becomes a story about ownership and individuality. Who gets to decide what someone's purpose is? Who gets to define their identity? And can a person ever truly be reduced to the science that created them? Those ideas add a layer of humanity to the larger narrative. Because while corporations are fighting for data and scientists are chasing solutions, Macy is simply trying to live a normal life. That's what makes her role so important. She stands at the intersection of nearly every major theme in the movie: science, ethics, corporate ambition, genetic manipulation, human responsibility. All of those ideas eventually connect back to her in one way or another. Now, whether the film explores these concepts as deeply as it could have is certainly debatable. There are moments where the blockbuster pacing pushes the story forward before those questions can fully develop, but the themes are still there, and they make Macy much more than a typical character who needs rescuing. She's a reminder that behind every scientific breakthrough, every experiment, and every ambitious project, there are real people affected by the consequences. In a movie filled with giant creatures and global threats, that personal perspective helps ground the story. Because at its core, Macy's journey isn't really about genetics. It's about identity, about finding out who you are when everyone else keeps trying to tell you what you are. One of the more intriguing directions Dominion takes is showing what happens when dinosaurs stop being rare scientific miracles and start becoming commodities. Because let's be honest, the moment dinosaurs entered the wider world, there was never any chance humanity would simply leave them alone. Someone was always going to try to profit from them, and that's exactly where the film goes. Early on, Dominion introduces a side of this new world that previous movies only hinted at. Instead of focusing entirely on research facilities and corporations, the story dives into illegal markets, underground networks, and people who see dinosaurs as business opportunities. In some ways, this feels like one of the most believable developments in the entire franchise. Think about it. If rare animals are trafficked in the real world, if exotic species are sold illegally, and if organized crime finds ways to profit from almost anything valuable, then dinosaurs would instantly become the most lucrative black market product imaginable. The movie leans into that idea. Suddenly, dinosaurs aren't just wildlife. They're merchandise, weapons, entertainment, status symbols, assets, and that's a pretty dark evolution of the franchise's central concept. Because it shows humanity repeating the same mistakes yet again. Rather than respecting these creatures or learning from past disasters, people immediately start finding ways to exploit them. Some breed them, some sell them. Some use them for sport, others use them as tools to build power and wealth. What's interesting is that these sequences give us one of the few glimpses of how the wider world has adapted to dinosaurs being loose across the planet. For a brief period, the movie feels almost like a crime thriller. You get a sense that an entire underground economy has developed around prehistoric creatures. And honestly, I found that concept fascinating. Not because it's uplifting, because it feels believable. Whenever something rare, dangerous, or valuable exists, human nature tends to create a market for it. The dinosaurs become another example of that pattern. These scenes also help reinforce one of the movie's recurring themes. The greatest threat isn't always the animals, it's what people choose to do with them. Again and again, Dominion suggests that human greed creates far more problems than the dinosaurs themselves. The creatures are often just caught in the middle, used, moved, bought, sold, exploited, viewed as products instead of living beings. At the same time, these black market sequences add a different flavor to the film's action. The environments feel less familiar than the forests and facilities we've seen countless times before. There's a sense that the franchise is briefly stepping into new territory, showing a world where dinosaurs have become integrated into criminal activity and global commerce. Could the movie have explored this idea even further? Absolutely. In fact, it's one of those concepts that feels rich enough to support an entire film on its own. But even in the limited time it receives, the illegal dinosaur trade helps make the world feel larger. More complicated, more realistic, because if dinosaurs truly existed in modern society, black markets wouldn't be an exception, they'd be inevitable, and Dominion understands that surprisingly well. One of the biggest challenges Dominion faces is that it isn't trying to tell just one story, it's trying to tell several stories at the same time, and whether that works for you will probably determine a large part of your overall experience with the movie. From the very beginning, the film splits its attention between different groups of characters who are pursuing completely different objectives. On one side, you have Owen and Claire dealing with Macy's disappearance and the personal crisis surrounding her. Their storyline is built around rescue, survival, and family. On the other side, you have Ellie Sattler investigating a growing ecological threat, eventually reconnecting with Alan Grant and working alongside Ian Malcolm. Their storyline leans much more into mystery, investigation, and corporate conspiracy. For a while, these stories almost feel like separate movies. They're happening simultaneously, but they're not really connected beyond existing in the same world. And that's where things get interesting, because the movie's entire structure depends on eventually bringing these threads together. You can almost feel Dominion trying to balance two different eras of the franchise at once. The Jurassic World era and the Jurassic Park era, the newer characters have their own emotional journey. The legacy characters have their own mission. The film spends a significant amount of time moving both groups toward the same destination. In theory, it's a clever idea. Fans of the original trilogy get plenty of time with Alan, Ellie, and Malcolm. Fans of the newer films still have Owen and Claire at the center of the action. Nobody gets completely pushed aside. At least that's the intention. The challenge is that managing so many moving pieces isn't easy. Every time the movie cuts away from one storyline, it has to rebuild momentum when it returns. Every subplot requires screen time. Every character needs attention, and with such a large cast, that balancing act becomes increasingly difficult. There are moments where the structure works surprisingly well. The different storylines create variety. One sequence might focus on investigation, another on action, another on suspense. The constant shifting helps prevent the film from feeling stuck in a single mode for too long. But there are also moments where the narrative starts feeling crowded. You can sense the movie juggling a lot of responsibilities, multiple protagonists, multiple objectives, multiple villains, multiple threats, multiple themes. Sometimes it all comes together smoothly. Other times you can almost see the strain of trying to keep everything connected. What's fascinating is that the dual story approach reflects the film's larger purpose. Dominion isn't simply trying to conclude one trilogy. It's trying to bring together two different generations of Jurassic storytelling. The structure itself becomes part of that mission. The old heroes, the new heroes. The old problems, the new problems. Everything gradually converging toward a shared finale. Whether the execution is completely successful is open to debate. Some viewers appreciate the ambition and enjoy seeing both generations occupy meaningful roles. Others feel the story becomes overstuffed because of how many separate threads are competing for attention. But regardless of where you land, the dual story structure is one of the defining features of Dominion. It's the framework holding the entire movie together, and it's also one of the main reasons the film often feels much bigger, busier, and more complicated than any previous entry in the franchise. Let's be honest. For a lot of people, the moment Laura Dern, Sam Neill, and Jeff Goldblum were announced for Dominion, the movie instantly became more exciting. Before anyone knew what the story was about, before the trailers, before the reviews. Just seeing those names together again was enough. Because regardless of how people feel about the later Jurassic films, those three characters are deeply connected to what made the original Jurassic Park special in the first place. Alan Grant, Ellie Sattler, Ian Malcolm. For many fans, they're not just characters, they're part of the identity of the franchise. So when Dominion promised to reunite them on screen, expectations naturally went through the roof. And to the movie's credit, this isn't a brief cameo situation. The film doesn't simply bring them back for a few nostalgic scenes before pushing them into the background. They're actually given a substantial role in the story. They have their own investigation, their own objectives, their own narrative importance. That decision alone separates Dominion from many legacy sequels that rely on older characters purely as marketing tools. Now, whether every scene involving them works is another conversation, but their presence definitely changes the energy of the film. The moment these characters appear, there's an immediate sense of familiarity. Not because they're doing anything revolutionary, because they remind audiences of where this entire journey started. You can feel the history attached to them, the years between films, the memories people have of the original movie. All of that naturally comes into the room with them. What's particularly interesting is how differently each character contributes. Ian Malcolm still brings much of the wit and sarcasm that audiences expect. Even when the movie becomes overly serious, he often provides moments of relief and personality. Ellie Sattler drives much of the investigation, giving the story momentum whenever it starts slowing down. Alan Grant, meanwhile, feels like the audience surrogate in many ways. He's once again pulled into circumstances he'd probably rather avoid, which is strangely fitting for a character who spent decades trying to stay away from dinosaur-related disasters. And then there's the chemistry. That's probably the most important part, because no amount of nostalgia works if the actors themselves don't feel comfortable slipping back into these roles. Fortunately, there's still a natural rhythm between them. Especially between Sam Neill and Laura Dern, the familiarity never feels forced. You get the sense that these characters have shared a lifetime of experiences long before this movie begins. That's something difficult to manufacture. At the same time, the reunion creates its own challenge. The moment you bring back beloved legacy characters, audiences start expecting something special, not just appearances, not just references, something meaningful. And that's where reactions begin to differ. Some viewers were simply thrilled to spend time with these characters again. For them, the reunion alone delivered exactly what they wanted. Others felt the film relied too heavily on nostalgia and struggled to give the returning cast material worthy of their importance. It's an understandable criticism. When characters carry this much history, expectations become incredibly difficult to satisfy. Still, regardless of where you stand on the execution, there's no denying the significance of seeing them together again. For the first time, the original heroes and the newer generation occupy the same adventure. The franchise finally brings its past and present into the same frame. And honestly, even before evaluating whether it fully works, that's one of the reasons Dominion generated so much anticipation in the first place. For many fans, seeing these characters walk back into the Jurassic universe wasn't just another plot development. It felt like coming home. The moment Dominion was announced, there was one thing everyone knew it was going to lean on heavily. Nostalgia, and honestly, how could it not? This franchise has been around for nearly 3 decades. Entire generations grew up with Jurassic Park. Some people watched the original in theaters. Others discovered it years later on television, DVDs, streaming platforms, or through the newer Jurassic World films. No matter when you entered the franchise, there's a good chance you have some emotional connection to it. Dominion knows that, very well actually. Throughout the movie, there are countless moments designed to remind audiences of where this journey began. Familiar faces return, certain visual callbacks appear, old relationships resurface. Even small character interactions occasionally feel like they're speaking directly to longtime fans. And to be fair, some of those moments work really well, because nostalgia isn't automatically a bad thing. When it's used carefully, it can add emotional weight. It can make a scene feel richer simply because of the history attached to it. A glance between two characters can mean more than an entire page of dialogue because the audience already knows what they've been through together. That's the advantage Dominion has. It doesn't need to build every emotional connection from scratch. Some of those connections have existed for nearly 30 years. The challenge comes when nostalgia starts carrying responsibilities that the story itself should be carrying. That's where opinions begin to split. For some viewers, the callbacks are enjoyable celebrations of the franchise's history. They create a sense of continuity and reward fans who have stayed invested all these years. For others, certain moments feel less like storytelling and more like reminders, a wink to the audience, a deliberate attempt to trigger recognition, and there's a fine line between those two things. The movie walks that line constantly, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully. What's fascinating is that Dominion almost feels aware of its own legacy. It understands that audiences are bringing memories into the theater with them, memories of the original park, memories of iconic scenes, memories of characters who helped define the franchise. So instead of trying to escape those expectations, the film embraces them. It leans into them. The result is a movie that often feels like a reunion as much as a sequel, not just for the characters, for the audience as well. You're revisiting old relationships, old ideas, old emotions, even some familiar narrative beats. And that's where nostalgia becomes both a strength and a weakness. Because every time Dominion reminds you of Jurassic Park, it also reminds you of the incredibly high standard that film established. That's a difficult comparison for any sequel to survive. The more the movie celebrates its past, the more it invites audiences to measure the present against it. Some fans will appreciate that connection. Others may find themselves wishing the film spent more time creating new memories instead of revisiting old ones. But regardless of where you land, nostalgia is woven into almost every corner of Dominion. It's part of the movie's identity, part of its marketing, part of its emotional appeal, and in many ways, part of its survival strategy, because Dominion isn't just trying to tell another story. It's trying to celebrate everything that came before it. Whether that celebration feels earned, excessive, or somewhere in between will depend entirely on the viewer. But there's no question that the film views its legacy as one of its greatest assets. And it isn't shy about using it. While a lot of the attention around Dominion understandably went toward the return of the original Jurassic Park cast, it's easy to forget that this is still, technically, Owen and Claire's story. At least that's how the film begins. When we first reconnect with them, they're no longer the people we met back in Jurassic World. They've gone through multiple disasters, survived more dinosaur encounters than should be humanly possible, and settled into a very different life. The biggest change is Macy. Protecting her has become their entire world, and honestly, that's what gives their storyline its emotional foundation. For the first time, Owen and Claire aren't trying to save a park, expose a conspiracy, or survive a catastrophe. They're acting like parents, or at least trying to, and that's where some of the tension immediately appears, because their idea of protection isn't necessarily Macy's idea of freedom. The film spends some time exploring that conflict. Owen and Claire genuinely want to keep her safe, but their methods often make her feel isolated and trapped. It's a fairly believable dynamic, especially given the circumstances. After all, they're not protecting an ordinary teenager. They're protecting someone that powerful organizations are actively searching for. Once Macy disappears, their storyline shifts into full rescue mode. And from that point forward, Owen and Claire become the driving force behind much of the movie's action. Car chases, motorcycle pursuits, escapes, dinosaur encounters, risky missions. The film rarely lets them sit still for very long. What's interesting is how differently the two characters function at this stage of the trilogy. Claire feels considerably different from the woman introduced in Jurassic World. She's become more compassionate, more emotionally invested, and much more willing to put herself at risk for others. Owen, meanwhile, remains largely what audiences expect him to be, the capable survivalist, the dinosaur expert, the guy who somehow ends up standing face to face with creatures that should probably be eating him. That's not necessarily a criticism. The character has a clear role within the franchise, and Dominion sticks closely to it. At the same time, reactions to Owen and Claire's storyline tend to vary quite a bit. Some viewers appreciate having familiar protagonists guiding the audience through the chaos. After 3 films, there's a level of comfort that comes with spending time with these characters. Others feel that the returning Jurassic Park cast occasionally overshadows them, making it harder for their journey to feel like the true center of the movie. And honestly, that's understandable. Dominion is trying to balance 2 generations of heroes simultaneously, which means attention inevitably gets divided. Still, Owen and Claire remain crucial to the structure of the film. Their search for Macy provides urgency, their relationship provides emotional grounding, and their perspective keeps the movie connected to the Jurassic World trilogy rather than turning entirely into a Jurassic Park reunion project. Whether they're your favorite characters or not, their journey serves an important purpose. They represent the modern era of the franchise, the bridge between where Jurassic World started and where Dominion ultimately ends. And while the dinosaurs may dominate the marketing, the action, and most of the headlines, much of the movie's emotional momentum still rests on Owen and Claire trying to protect the family they've built in the middle of a world that has become increasingly difficult to control. One of the most interesting things about Dominion is that it has absolutely no shortage of characters. In fact, if anything, it has the opposite problem. There are a lot of people in this movie. You have the original Jurassic Park trio: Owen and Claire, Macy, Henry Wu, Biosyn employees, new allies, new villains, supporting characters spread across multiple storylines. The cast is huge, and whenever a movie starts juggling this many characters at once, a question naturally appears. Does everyone actually get enough room to matter? For me, that's where Dominion becomes a little inconsistent. Some characters arrive with clear motivations and recognizable personalities. You understand why they're involved in the story and what they're trying to achieve. Even when their screen time isn't enormous, they leave an impression because their role is clearly defined. Others aren't quite as fortunate. There are moments where certain characters feel less like fully developed individuals and more like pieces being moved around a very large plot. They're present because the story needs them to be present. They're involved because the narrative requires them to reach a certain location or trigger a certain event. And when that happens, emotional investment becomes more difficult. What's interesting is that the film often succeeds when it focuses on smaller character interactions. A conversation, a reunion, a moment of concern, a bit of humor. These scenes tend to feel more natural because the movie isn't trying to move 10 different plotlines forward at the same time. It's simply allowing the characters to exist. The challenge comes from the sheer amount of narrative territory Dominion is trying to cover. The movie wants to be a global adventure, a conspiracy thriller, a dinosaur survival story, a franchise finale, a legacy sequel, and every one of those goals requires attention. As a result, character development occasionally gets pushed aside in favor of momentum. The plot keeps moving, the locations keep changing. The action keeps escalating, but not every character receives enough space to grow alongside those events. This is especially noticeable because the franchise has such a strong history of memorable personalities. When audiences think back to Jurassic Park, they don't just remember the dinosaurs, they remember the people. They remember the way those characters reacted to wonder, fear, danger, and discovery. That's a difficult standard to live up to. Dominion certainly tries to give everyone something meaningful to do, but the results vary from character to character. Some emerge as highlights, some feel underutilized, some are memorable because of their performances rather than their writing, and some simply get lost in the crowd. That doesn't mean the film completely fails on a character level. Far from it. There are genuine moments of warmth, humor, and connection scattered throughout the movie. The issue is consistency. With so many storylines competing for attention, the film rarely has enough time to fully explore every character the way it might have wanted. In the end, Dominion's character writing reflects the larger strengths and weaknesses of the movie itself. It's ambitious, it's crowded, it's trying to accomplish a lot at once. Sometimes that ambition creates engaging interactions and memorable moments. Other times it leaves characters feeling like they deserved just a little more room to breathe. And honestly, that's probably one of the most recurring themes of the entire film. Not a lack of ideas, just too many of them sharing the same screen. Every Jurassic movie needs some kind of human antagonist. Not because the dinosaurs aren't dangerous enough, but because this franchise has always been interested in a very specific type of villain, the person who thinks they're smarter than the consequences. And in Dominion, that role belongs to Lewis Dodgson, the head of BioSyn, the man sitting at the center of the film's biggest controversies. What's interesting is that Dodgson isn't presented as a traditional blockbuster villain. He's not a military commander trying to weaponize dinosaurs. He's not leading an army. He's not threatening the world through brute force. His power comes from influence, resources, control. He's the kind of character who makes decisions from offices, boardrooms, and laboratories rather than battlefields. In theory, that's a pretty strong setup, because the Jurassic franchise has always worked best when it reminds us that the greatest disasters usually begin with ordinary people making irresponsible choices. The dinosaurs are often the result, not the cause. Dodgson fits naturally into that tradition. He's another example of someone who believes he can manage forces larger than himself. Someone convinced that intelligence and authority are enough to keep everything under control. The problem is that many viewers never found him particularly intimidating, and that's where reactions to the character start becoming mixed. For a villain who sits at the center of so much conflict, Dodgson often feels surprisingly distant from the action. He's present, he's important, but he rarely dominates scenes in the way memorable antagonists tend to. When people discuss Dominion afterward, they're much more likely to remember the dinosaurs, the returning cast, or specific action sequences than they are to remember the villain. That's usually not a great sign. Part of the issue comes from how the movie approaches his personality. Rather than presenting him as terrifying, charismatic, or emotionally complex, the film leans heavily into the image of a wealthy corporate executive whose ambition has gone too far. There's nothing inherently wrong with that concept. In fact, it fits the themes of the story quite well, but concepts and execution are two different things. A villain can represent important ideas while still struggling to leave a lasting impression. And that's where Dodgson often finds himself. He's less of a character audiences love to hate and more of a symbol for the film's larger concerns about corporate power, scientific irresponsibility, and unchecked greed. That symbolic role gives him narrative importance, but it doesn't always give him dramatic presence. What's fascinating is that the movie repeatedly tells us how powerful and influential he is. We understand his position. We understand his resources. We understand the damage his decisions can cause. Yet emotionally, the character sometimes feels overshadowed by the chaos happening around him. The dinosaurs feel bigger. The returning heroes feel more important. Even some supporting characters occasionally leave stronger impressions. And for a main antagonist, that's a difficult challenge to overcome. Still, Dodgson serves an important purpose within the story. He embodies many of the franchise's oldest warnings: the belief that profit matters more than responsibility, the belief that innovation excuses recklessness, the belief that control is possible right up until everything falls apart. In that sense, he's a very Jurassic villain, not because he's physically threatening, because he's another reminder that the most dangerous creatures in this universe aren't always prehistoric. Sometimes they're the people who refuse to learn from history, and Dominion spends much of its runtime showing exactly what happens when those people gain too much power. One of the more overlooked parts of Dominion is what it does with Henry Wu, and honestly, that's understandable. When you have giant dinosaurs, returning legacy characters, global conspiracies, and multiple storylines competing for attention, it's easy for a character like Wu to get lost in the background. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, he's actually one of the most important figures in the entire franchise. Because unlike most of the characters, Henry Wu has been connected to these events from the very beginning, long before the dinosaurs escaped, long before Jurassic World opened, long before Biosyn became involved. He was one of the people helping make all of this possible. In many ways, he represents the scientific side of the Jurassic saga, the pursuit of discovery, the excitement of innovation, and unfortunately, the consequences that followed. What's interesting about Dominion is that it approaches Wu very differently than some of the previous films. Earlier appearances often positioned him closer to the source of the problem. He wasn't necessarily portrayed as evil, but he frequently came across as someone willing to push ethical boundaries in pursuit of scientific advancement. The science itself fascinated him. The risks seemed secondary. Dominion shifts that perspective. For perhaps the first time, the character appears genuinely burdened by the results of those decisions. There's a sense that the consequences have finally become impossible to ignore. The experiments, the unintended outcomes, the environmental damage, the growing chaos. All of it traces back, at least partially, to choices made by people like him, and that realization becomes central to his storyline. Rather than continuing down the same path, Wu spends much of the film searching for a way to fix the damage, not erase it, not undo everything, just prevent things from becoming even worse. That's an important distinction. Because true redemption in stories like this rarely comes from pretending mistakes never happened. It comes from accepting responsibility for them. Whether the film fully develops that idea is certainly debatable. Some viewers may feel his arc moves too quickly. Others may wish the movie spent more time exploring his guilt and personal accountability. Given how many storylines Dominion is balancing, those criticisms are understandable. Still, the intent is clear. Wu's journey is about confronting the consequences of scientific ambition. He's a character who spent years helping push boundaries, only to discover that crossing those boundaries created problems far larger than he anticipated. And in that sense, his story ties directly into one of the franchise's oldest themes. The danger isn't knowledge itself. The danger is believing that knowledge frees you from responsibility. That's a lesson the Jurassic universe has been teaching for decades. Wu simply happens to be one of the characters forced to learn it the hard way. What I find particularly interesting is that Dominion doesn't treat him as a traditional villain by the end. Instead, it presents him as someone trying to make things right, someone attempting to contribute to a solution rather than another disaster. Whether audiences fully embrace that redemption is going to vary from person to person. Some may find it satisfying. Others may feel the character's past actions require far greater consequences. But regardless of where you stand, Henry Wu's role in Dominion carries symbolic weight. He's more than a scientist. He's a representation of the franchise's entire relationship with progress, the promise of innovation, the temptation of playing creator, and the difficult realization that every breakthrough comes with responsibilities that can't simply be ignored. In a movie filled with dinosaurs, corporate conspiracies, and world-changing events, Wu's storyline quietly asks a very human question. What do you do when you finally realize you're part of the problem? And more importantly, is it ever too late to try fixing it? If there's one area where opinions about Dominion become especially heated, it's the writing. Because no matter how impressive the dinosaurs look, no matter how much nostalgia the movie delivers, eventually everything comes back to the story being told. And that's where Dominion becomes a fascinating contradiction. On one hand, the screenplay is undeniably ambitious. This isn't a small movie trying to accomplish one simple objective. It's attempting to conclude an entire trilogy, reconnect multiple generations of characters, expand the world beyond the islands, explore corporate corruption, tackle ecological concerns, continue Macy's story, and somehow still function as a dinosaur adventure. That's a lot, maybe too much. Watching the film, you can almost feel the screenplay constantly juggling responsibilities. Every few minutes, a new plot thread appears, a new objective emerges, a new character enters. A new piece of information is revealed. The movie rarely slows down because it always seems to have another storyline it wants to address, and that's where reactions begin to split. Some viewers appreciate the scale of that ambition. They enjoy how much is happening and how many moving pieces the story tries to connect. There's always something happening, always another destination, another discovery, another threat waiting around the corner. Others see the same thing and arrive at the opposite conclusion. For them, the movie feels overloaded, not because the ideas are bad individually, but because there are so many of them competing for attention at the same time. That's probably the screenplay's biggest challenge. Very few of its ideas are inherently uninteresting. The problem is that they all want screen time, and when too many ideas share the same movie, some inevitably receive less development than they deserve. Another common criticism involves exposition. Dominion often spends a considerable amount of time explaining things, scientific concepts, corporate plans, character motivations, plot mechanics. The film clearly wants the audience to understand what's happening, but occasionally those explanations become so frequent that they interrupt momentum. Instead of discovering information naturally, characters sometimes stop to tell us exactly what we need to know. That can make certain sections feel heavier than they probably needed to be. At the same time, there are moments where the screenplay genuinely shines, particularly when it allows characters to interact naturally. Some of the conversations between returning characters carry warmth and personality. Certain humorous exchanges land surprisingly well, and when the movie focuses on suspense or adventure rather than explanation, it often becomes much more engaging. What's interesting is that the screenplay feels caught between two different goals. One version of the film wants to be a thoughtful science fiction story, exploring humanity's relationship with nature, technology, and power. The other version wants to be a giant summer blockbuster, filled with dinosaurs chasing people across increasingly dangerous environments. Neither approach is inherently wrong. The challenge comes from trying to do both simultaneously. Sometimes the balance works, sometimes one side overwhelms the other, and that's ultimately what makes Dominion's screenplay so divisive. It's not a story suffering from a lack of ideas, quite the opposite. It has ideas everywhere, themes. Characters, mysteries, conspiracies, scientific dilemmas, action sequences, nostalgia, world building. The issue isn't scarcity, it's abundance. The screenplay is constantly reaching for something bigger, broader, and more ambitious. Whether that ambition results in a rich, layered adventure or an overstuffed narrative depends largely on the viewer. But one thing is undeniable. Dominion doesn't fail because it had nothing to say. If anything, it may have tried to say too much all at once. Now we need to talk about something that comes up again and again whenever people discuss Dominion: the logic, or depending on who you ask, the lack of it. Because this is one of those movies where your enjoyment often depends on how willing you are to simply go along for the ride. And to be fair, every Jurassic movie requires some suspension of disbelief. Even the original film asked audiences to accept cloned dinosaurs, advanced genetic engineering, and an entire theme park built around extinct species. The franchise has never been hard science fiction. But Dominion pushes that flexibility further than most previous entries. There are moments throughout the film where events happen because the story needs them to happen. Characters arrive in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. People survive situations that seem almost impossible to survive. Critical information appears at convenient moments. Multiple storylines somehow converge with remarkable precision. And while none of these moments completely break the movie, they do start to accumulate. That's really the key issue. One coincidence isn't a problem. Two coincidences probably aren't a problem either. But when enough conveniences stack on top of each other, some viewers begin noticing the machinery behind the story. Instead of feeling like events are unfolding naturally, they start feeling guided, directed, arranged. What's interesting is that many of these issues are tied directly to the movie's enormous scope. Dominion is trying to move a large cast across multiple locations while eventually bringing everyone together for a shared finale. That's not easy, and sometimes the screenplay chooses the fastest route rather than the most believable one. You can see this in character decisions as well. There are moments where people take risks that seem questionable. Moments where obvious solutions are overlooked. Moments where survival depends less on planning and more on the fact that the movie isn't ready to lose that character yet. Again, these aren't unique problems. Blockbusters do this all the time. The difference is that Dominion asks audiences to accept quite a lot of them in a relatively short period. Then there's the world building. And honestly, this is where things become particularly interesting. The film introduces a world fundamentally transformed by dinosaurs. That's a massive concept. Naturally, viewers begin asking questions. How do governments manage this situation? How do ecosystems adapt? How does transportation change? How does agriculture change? How does daily life change? The movie provides some answers, but mostly it offers glimpses, hints, pieces of a larger picture. For some viewers, that's enough. They enjoy filling in the gaps themselves. Others wanted a deeper exploration of this transformed world and felt the film left too many fascinating questions unanswered. And that's understandable because the premise practically invites curiosity. The world of Dominion is arguably one of the most interesting settings the franchise has ever created. The challenge is that the story doesn't always stop long enough to fully explore it. Instead, it keeps moving forward. Toward the next chase, the next discovery, the next crisis. What's fascinating is that many of the logic criticisms stem from the same place as many of the movie's strengths: ambition. Dominion is trying to tell a huge story. A global story, a franchise-ending story. And the larger a story becomes, the harder it is to keep every moving part perfectly believable. Some viewers will happily overlook those imperfections because they're invested in the adventure. Others will find them impossible to ignore. Neither reaction is wrong. It's simply the result of a film constantly prioritizing momentum over realism. Because at the end of the day, Dominion isn't asking whether every detail makes perfect sense. It's asking whether you're willing to follow it anyway. And for many viewers, that's where the experience either succeeds or falls apart. One of the most common criticisms directed at Dominion has nothing to do with the dinosaurs, the cast, or even the story itself. It's the length, because this movie is big, not just in scale, in runtime. And while a long movie isn't automatically a problem, it does create a challenge. The longer a film becomes, the more carefully every minute has to justify its existence. That's where Dominion starts running into trouble for some viewers. The movie has so much it wants to accomplish that it spends a large portion of its runtime setting pieces into motion. New characters need introductions. Returning characters need reintroductions. Separate storylines need to be established. Mysteries need to be explained. Threats need to be identified. By the time everything is finally moving in the same direction, a significant amount of time has already passed. What's interesting is that the film rarely feels slow because nothing is happening. In fact, something is almost always happening. The issue is that not everything feels equally important. Certain scenes move the story forward. Others feel like they exist primarily to connect one major event to another. And when a movie approaches the 2.5-hour mark, those transitional moments become much more noticeable. The opening portion is where this is felt most strongly. Dominion spends a considerable amount of time establishing its world and its various plot threads before the story fully clicks into gear. For some viewers, that's a worthwhile investment. They're interested in the setup and appreciate the effort to build the larger picture. Others may find themselves waiting for the movie to reach the adventure they came to see. Then there's the opposite issue later on. Once the action finally ramps up, the film almost swings too far in the other direction. The pace becomes relentless: escapes, chases, discoveries, confrontations. One event immediately leads into another. At times, it can feel like the movie is sprinting to the finish line after spending so much time preparing for the race. This creates an unusual rhythm. Some sections feel stretched. Others feel compressed. The balance isn't always consistent, and that's largely because Dominion is carrying the weight of multiple movies inside a single film. It wants to be a mystery, a conspiracy thriller, a family story, a science fiction adventure, a legacy sequel, a franchise finale. Each of those ideas could easily occupy an entire movie on its own. Here, they're all competing for space within the same runtime. As a result, viewers often leave with completely different impressions. Some feel the movie drags, others feel it's overloaded. Interestingly, those two criticisms aren't actually opposites. They're symptoms of the same issue. The film has so much material that it occasionally struggles to distribute its attention evenly. What's frustrating is that you can see why the runtime exists. Very little of the movie feels unnecessary in isolation. The problem emerges when all those pieces are assembled together. The cumulative effect creates a film that occasionally feels heavier than it needs to be, not because the ideas are weak, because there are so many of them. And that's what makes Dominion's pacing such an interesting discussion. It's not a movie lacking content. If anything, it's overflowing with it. The challenge isn't finding things to put in the film. The challenge is finding enough room for all of them without exhausting the audience along the way. For some viewers, the journey remains engaging from beginning to end. For others, the sheer amount of story being packed into one movie eventually becomes part of the obstacle itself. At the end of the day, this is still a Jurassic movie, which means no matter how much time the film spends discussing genetics, corporations, ecological disasters, or scientific ethics, eventually people are going to ask a much simpler question: are the action scenes any good? And honestly, this is one area where Dominion probably has its strongest argument. Because whatever issues you may have with the story, the movie rarely forgets that audiences came to see dinosaurs doing dinosaur things. From the very beginning, the film throws its characters into one dangerous situation after another. There are pursuits through crowded streets, close encounters with predators, aerial dangers, underground threats, escapes that go wrong. rescues that become even bigger disasters. The movie is constantly moving its characters from one high-risk scenario to the next. What's interesting is how much broader the action feels compared to earlier entries. For years, the franchise was largely confined to islands, jungles, and research facilities. Dominion expands the playground. Now dinosaurs can appear almost anywhere. That change gives the action sequences a different flavor. The environments feel more varied, the dangers feel less predictable, and occasionally, the movie finds genuinely creative ways to place prehistoric creatures into modern settings. One sequence in particular tends to stand out for many viewers, the Malta sequence. Even among people who are critical of the film overall, this portion frequently gets singled out as one of the highlights. It's fast, chaotic, energetic, and for a brief stretch, Dominion feels completely alive. The movie stops explaining itself and simply lets the action take over. That's often where it works best. Because regardless of narrative complexity, the franchise has always understood the basic appeal of seeing human beings try to survive encounters with creatures that should not exist, and Dominion delivers plenty of those moments. The film also benefits from having a large variety of creatures to work with. Not every encounter feels identical. Different dinosaurs create different types of danger. Some scenes focus on pursuit, others focus on stealth. Others become outright survival horror. That variety helps prevent the action from becoming entirely repetitive, at least for a while, because repetition is where some criticisms begin to emerge. The film spends so much time placing characters in danger that eventually the structure becomes familiar. A threat appears, characters escape, another threat appears, characters escape again, then another, and another. By the later stages of the movie, some viewers may begin noticing the pattern, not because the individual sequences are poorly made, because there are simply so many of them. What's fascinating is that Dominion often feels torn between being a science fiction adventure and a creature feature roller coaster. When it leans into pure adventure, it can be incredibly entertaining. The movie understands spectacle. It understands scale. It understands how to stage encounters that keep audiences engaged. The challenge comes when those sequences need to carry emotional weight as well. Sometimes the action serves the story. Other times it feels like the story exists to connect the action, and that's a subtle but important difference. Still, even critics of the film often acknowledge that the movie delivers on spectacle. There are dinosaurs, lots of dinosaurs. Running, flying, hunting, fighting, causing chaos. If your primary goal is to experience a large-scale dinosaur adventure, Dominion certainly makes sure you're never far away from the next set piece. Whether every sequence is equally memorable is another discussion, but there's no question that the film commits fully to delivering the kind of blockbuster action audiences expect from the franchise. And for many viewers, that's ultimately where a large part of the entertainment value comes from. One thing that's easy to forget about Jurassic Park is that, underneath all the wonder and adventure, it was often a horror movie. Not in the traditional sense. There were no ghosts, no supernatural forces, no masked killers, but Spielberg understood something important. Dinosaurs are terrifying. A massive predator hunting you through a confined space is already a horror premise. The original film knew exactly how to use that fear. It wasn't always about showing the dinosaur. Sometimes it was about hearing it, sensing it, waiting for it. That's where suspense comes from, and Dominion occasionally tries to tap back into that side of the franchise. There are moments where the movie slows down and allows tension to build naturally. Instead of immediately rushing into action, it focuses on uncertainty. Where is the creature? How close is it? Can the characters escape before they're discovered? Those questions are often more effective than the actual attack itself. One sequence that stands out is Claire's encounter with a dinosaur early in the film. The scene feels noticeably different from much of the surrounding movie. The pacing slows. The camera becomes more patient. The focus shifts from spectacle to survival. For a few minutes, Dominion feels much closer to a suspense thriller than a blockbuster adventure. And honestly, it works, because fear usually becomes more effective when it's personal. When the danger feels immediate, when escape doesn't seem guaranteed. Throughout the film, there are several moments where Dominion flirts with that horror identity. Dark environments, predators lurking nearby, characters trying not to be detected, situations where one wrong movement could trigger disaster. Those scenes often rank among the movie's strongest because they rely on tension rather than scale. The audience isn't impressed, they're nervous. There's a difference. What's interesting is that the film doesn't always commit to this approach. Just as suspense begins building, Dominion often transitions back into large-scale action. The quiet fear gives way to explosions, chases, or major set pieces. That's not necessarily a flaw. It's simply the style of movie Dominion chooses to be. The problem is that suspense and action create very different emotional experiences. Action releases tension, suspense builds it, and because the movie spends so much time moving from one event to another, it sometimes sacrifices the opportunity to let fear fully develop. You can almost feel the film wanting to keep the energy high. The result is that some genuinely creepy situations end sooner than they probably should. The dinosaurs look dangerous. The setups are effective. But the movie often rushes toward the payoff before fully exploiting the anticipation. That's why reactions to the suspense elements tend to be mixed. Some viewers appreciate the horror-inspired moments and wish there were more of them. Others are satisfied with the balance between fear and adventure. Personally, I think Dominion is at its most effective when it remembers that dinosaurs don't always need to be fighting each other or chasing vehicles. Sometimes all they need to do is exist nearby. A creature hiding in the shadows can be more frightening than a dozen explosions. The original Jurassic Park understood that perfectly. Dominion occasionally remembers it. And when it does, the movie suddenly becomes much more tense, much more focused, and much more engaging. Because for all the spectacle this franchise delivers, one truth has never changed. The dinosaurs are often scariest when they're simply hunting. Let's face it, by the sixth movie, simply bringing back a Tyrannosaurus Rex isn't enough anymore. The audience has seen the T-Rex. They've seen velociraptors. They've seen mosasaurs, pteranodons, Indominus Rex, Indoraptor, you name it. At this point, every new Jurassic film has to answer the same question: what new creatures are you bringing to the table? And to Dominion's credit, it makes a genuine effort to expand the roster. The movie introduces several species that haven't received major attention in previous entries, and that immediately helps the world feel larger. For longtime dinosaur fans, that's one of the more enjoyable aspects of the film. You're constantly waiting to see what might appear next. Not every creature serves the same purpose, either. Some are introduced as threats, some are obstacles. Some are simply there to add variety and make the ecosystem feel more alive. That's an important distinction because Dominion occasionally treats dinosaurs less like movie monsters and more like animals occupying different ecological niches. And honestly, I appreciated that approach. The franchise has always walked a line between science fiction spectacle and prehistoric wildlife documentary. Sometimes it leans heavily toward giant monster entertainment. Other times it tries to remind audiences that these are living creatures with behaviors, instincts, and roles within a larger ecosystem. Dominion attempts a little of both. One of the most noticeable additions is the Giganotosaurus, which the film positions as one of its major predators. Naturally, whenever a new giant carnivore enters the franchise, comparisons begin immediately. How does it compare to the T-Rex? Is it more dangerous? Is it stronger? The movie clearly understands those expectations and uses them to generate excitement. Beyond the larger predators, there are also smaller additions that help diversify the experience. Some creatures bring speed, some bring stealth, some create unusual environments for action sequences, and some simply look different enough to keep the audience curious. The feathered dinosaurs are particularly interesting because they reflect changing scientific interpretations of prehistoric life. For years, popular culture presented dinosaurs in one specific way. Modern research has gradually challenged some of those assumptions. Dominion doesn't fully transform the franchise into a scientific reconstruction project, but it does acknowledge newer ideas by incorporating feathered designs into several creatures. It's a small detail, yet it helps the film feel slightly more connected to contemporary dinosaur discussions. What's also worth mentioning is that the movie doesn't always treat its creatures as villains. That's a subtle but important shift. Many of the dinosaurs aren't hunting humans because they're evil. They're behaving like animals, territorial animals, predatory animals. Confused animals trying to survive in environments they were never supposed to inhabit. That perspective gives some of the encounters a different tone. The creatures become part of the world rather than simply obstacles for the heroes to overcome. Of course, not every dinosaur receives extensive screen time. With so many species appearing throughout the movie, some naturally leave stronger impressions than others. But the sheer variety helps maintain a sense of discovery. Even after decades of sequels, Dominion still finds ways to introduce creatures that feel new to the franchise. And honestly, that's important, because one of the original appeals of Jurassic Park was wonder. The excitement of seeing something you've never seen before. No matter how many sequels exist, that feeling still matters. And whenever Dominion unveils another species, another design, or another prehistoric surprise, you can feel the movie chasing that sense of wonder all over again. No matter where you stand on the story, the characters, or the pacing, there's one thing almost everyone seems to agree on when it comes to Dominion: the dinosaurs look fantastic. And honestly, after nearly 3 decades of Jurassic movies, that's not something we should take for granted. The original Jurassic Park completely changed what audiences thought was possible. Back in 1993, seeing those creatures on screen felt almost unreal, not because the technology was perfect, but because it was convincing enough to make people believe. Ever since then, every sequel has been chasing that same magic. Dominion benefits from something the original film could only dream of: modern visual effects technology. The dinosaurs move with incredible detail. Their skin textures feel more complex, their weight feels more believable, their expressions and behaviors feel more natural than ever. Whether they're towering over a landscape or standing only a few feet from the camera, there's rarely a moment where the creatures feel unfinished or artificial. And that's incredibly important, because this franchise lives or dies based on whether audiences accept the dinosaurs as real. The second that illusion breaks, everything else starts falling apart. Thankfully, Dominion keeps that illusion intact for most of its runtime. What's particularly impressive is the sheer number of creatures on display. The movie isn't dealing with one or two dinosaurs. It's constantly introducing different species, different environments, different lighting conditions, and different action sequences, yet the visual effects remain remarkably consistent. That's not easy to pull off, especially in a film this large. Another thing worth appreciating is how the movie combines multiple techniques rather than relying exclusively on computer-generated imagery. Several behind-the-scenes discussions revealed the continued use of practical effects and animatronic work alongside CGI. And honestly, that hybrid approach is one of the reasons the creatures often feel so convincing. When filmmakers can combine physical elements with digital enhancements, the results tend to feel more grounded. The dinosaurs occupy real space. Actors have something tangible to interact with. Lighting behaves more naturally. Small details become easier to believe. You can often feel the difference even if you don't consciously recognize why. What's fascinating is that Dominion occasionally showcases how far the franchise has come technologically. The dinosaurs don't simply exist on screen anymore. They inhabit the world. They're integrated into forests, cities, snowy environments, mountains, and crowded action sequences without feeling disconnected from their surroundings. That level of technical polish deserves recognition. Of course, spectacular visual effects don't automatically create a great movie. Several critics of Dominion have pointed that out. You can have incredible CGI and still struggle with storytelling. Both things can be true at the same time. But even many viewers who dislike the narrative often praised the visual presentation, because regardless of your opinion on the plot, it's difficult to deny the craftsmanship involved. The artists, animators, designers, and effects teams clearly put enormous effort into bringing these creatures to life, and that effort shows. If anything, Dominion demonstrates just how much the technical side of filmmaking has evolved since the franchise began. The original Jurassic Park amazed audiences because dinosaurs seemed real. Dominion amazes audiences because dinosaurs now feel fully integrated into an entire world. You may debate the screenplay. You may debate the characters. You may debate the direction. But when it comes to the dinosaurs themselves, Dominion rarely gives you a reason to complain. They're still the stars of the show, and visually they look better than ever. One thing that often gets lost in discussions about Dominion is just how good the movie looks. Not the dinosaurs specifically, the movie itself, because even people who walk away disappointed by the story usually admit that the film is visually impressive. And that's something worth talking about. From the very beginning, Dominion feels expensive, not in the sense of flashy budgets or obvious spending. It feels like a production operating on a massive scale. The locations are larger. The environments are more varied. The world feels broader than what we've seen in previous entries. For years, the franchise spent most of its time on islands, inside facilities, or deep within jungle environments. Dominion opens things up considerably. Snow-covered landscapes, dense forests, urban environments, mountain ranges, underground locations, research complexes. The movie constantly shifts its visual surroundings, and that variety helps prevent the experience from becoming visually repetitive. Even when the story slows down, there's usually something interesting to look at. That's where the cinematography becomes important. The camera often emphasizes scale, not just the scale of the dinosaurs, but the scale of the world they're now inhabiting. Wide shots are used effectively throughout the film, reminding audiences how much larger the Jurassic universe has become. The dinosaurs are no longer confined to isolated parks. They're part of a global environment. And visually, the movie tries to communicate that at every opportunity. What's interesting is how different locations create different moods. Some scenes lean heavily into wonder, others feel adventurous, some become suspenseful, and a few border on horror. The production design plays a major role in making those tonal shifts work. Every location feels intentionally constructed to support a particular type of scene. A laboratory creates tension through sterility and secrecy. A wilderness environment creates vulnerability. Urban settings create unpredictability. The film understands how surroundings influence emotion. And for the most part, it uses that knowledge effectively. Another thing I appreciate is that Dominion doesn't simply rely on dinosaurs filling the frame. Lesser films sometimes assume giant creatures alone are enough to create visual excitement. Here, there's generally a stronger sense of atmosphere. Weather, lighting, architecture, environmental detail, all of those elements contribute to the overall experience. The movie wants the world to feel lived in rather than simply functioning as a backdrop for action scenes. Now, that doesn't mean every visual choice works perfectly. Some action sequences become visually busy, especially when the editing speeds up and multiple things are happening simultaneously. There are moments where clarity takes a slight hit in pursuit of intensity, but those instances are relatively minor compared to the overall presentation. For most of its runtime, Dominion looks polished, confident, professional, like a blockbuster made by people who understand how to create cinematic scale. And honestly, that's one of the reasons the film remains watchable, even when certain story decisions become frustrating. The visual craftsmanship never disappears. The movie consistently gives audiences impressive imagery, interesting environments, and memorable settings. In a franchise built on spectacle, that's an important strength. Because regardless of how viewers feel about the narrative, Dominion succeeds in making the Jurassic World feel larger, richer, and more visually expansive than it has in years. And sometimes, especially in a movie about dinosaurs roaming the Earth, simply creating a world that audiences enjoy looking at is a significant achievement all on its own. At some point when discussing Dominion, the conversation naturally shifts toward Colin Trevorrow, because whether you love this movie, dislike it, or fall somewhere in the middle, it's impossible to separate the final result from the person steering the ship. This is, after all, the filmmaker who helped launch the Jurassic World era and then returned to close it out. And honestly, you can feel that throughout the movie. Dominion doesn't come across as a director simply trying to replicate the original Jurassic Park. If anything, it often feels like Trevorrow is trying to push the franchise into new territory. Sometimes that ambition works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's definitely there. One thing I noticed is that the film constantly experiments with tone. In one scene, it's a science fiction thriller. A few minutes later, it's an action movie. Then it becomes a survival adventure, then a mystery, then a conspiracy story, then a creature feature. That's a difficult balancing act. And depending on the viewer, that variety either keeps the movie interesting or makes it feel unfocused. What's fascinating is that Trevorrow rarely directs Dominion like a traditional dinosaur movie. Many of the sequences could exist in completely different genres if you removed the prehistoric creatures. There are chase scenes that feel like spy thrillers, investigation scenes that feel like corporate dramas, suspense scenes that border on horror. The dinosaurs are often inserted into these genres rather than the other way around. That's a unique approach, and I can understand why some people find it refreshing. At the same time, it contributes to one of the film's biggest challenges: identity. Because Dominion sometimes feels like it's trying to be 5 different movies at once. The direction embraces that complexity rather than simplifying it. The result is a movie that feels ambitious but occasionally scattered. Another interesting aspect of the filmmaking is how the movie handles scale. Trevorrow clearly understands that this isn't just another sequel. It's meant to feel like an event. The camera frequently emphasizes size, large environments, massive creatures, crowded storylines. Everything feels bigger than before. Sometimes that scale is genuinely impressive, other times it becomes overwhelming. The action sequences are probably the best example. There are moments where the direction allows tension to build naturally. The camera lingers, the audience waits, the danger slowly approaches. Those scenes tend to work very well. But there are also moments where the filmmaking becomes restless. The camera moves constantly, the editing speeds up, the scene becomes louder and more chaotic. Instead of increasing suspense, the intensity occasionally reduces it because everything is happening at once. That's one of the recurring criticisms surrounding Dominion's direction, not a lack of energy, too much energy. The film is so eager to keep moving that it sometimes rushes past opportunities for stronger emotional or dramatic impact. Still, I think it's important to acknowledge what Trevorrow was attempting. This wasn't a small assignment. He wasn't directing a standalone adventure. He was trying to conclude multiple storylines, unite two generations of characters, expand the scope of the franchise, introduce new themes, and satisfy decades of audience expectations. That's an enormous creative challenge. Whether he succeeds completely is obviously open to debate, but the ambition is undeniable. And honestly, that ambition defines Dominion as much as anything else. The movie constantly reaches for something bigger than a simple dinosaur sequel. Sometimes it grabs hold of it, sometimes it falls short, but it never feels like a filmmaker playing things safe. For better and for worse, Dominion is the result of a director trying to make the biggest Jurassic movie possible. And whether audiences embrace that vision or reject it, they can certainly see it on screen. For a movie this crowded, the cast has a surprisingly difficult job, because Dominion isn't asking one group of actors to carry the film. It's asking two generations of Jurassic characters to share the spotlight at the same time. That's a challenge all by itself. Every scene has to balance nostalgia, character continuity, new relationships, old relationships, and the expectations audiences already have for these people. And for the most part, the cast does a respectable job keeping everything together. Let's start with the obvious trio: Sam Neill, Laura Dern, and Jeff Goldblum. The moment they appear on screen, something changes. Not because they're given dramatically different material than everyone else, but because audiences already have decades of history with these characters. The actors understand that. They're not trying to reinvent Alan Grant, Ellie Sattler, or Ian Malcolm. They're simply stepping back into roles they know extremely well, and that familiarity helps, particularly in the quieter scenes. The conversations feel natural. The interactions feel lived in. You believe these characters share a history because, quite frankly, they do. Among the three, Jeff Goldblum probably leaves the strongest impression. Partly because Ian Malcolm has always been one of the franchise's most entertaining personalities. His dry humor, sarcasm, and slightly chaotic energy often bring life to scenes that might otherwise feel overly serious. Whenever the movie becomes weighed down by exposition or complicated plot mechanics, Goldblum usually finds a way to cut through it. Laura Dern and Sam Neill also benefit from the fact that their characters still work well together. The chemistry remains intact, nothing feels forced. There's a comfort level between them that the movie wisely allows room to breathe. Those moments don't rely on dinosaurs or action, they rely on people. And honestly, some of the film's most charming scenes emerge from that simplicity. Then you have the Jurassic World side of the cast. Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard return as Owen and Claire, and by this point, they know exactly what these characters are supposed to be. Pratt continues operating in his familiar lane, confident, capable, and always one dinosaur encounter away from holding up his hand. Whether that works for you probably depends on how much you've enjoyed the character throughout the trilogy. Bryce Dallas Howard arguably gets some of the film's more interesting moments, particularly when the movie leans into suspense rather than action. She often feels more vulnerable than many of the other characters, which helps certain scenes carry additional tension. What's interesting is that the movie occasionally struggles to balance these two groups, not because the actors lack chemistry, because audience attention naturally shifts toward whichever characters they feel most connected to. Some viewers came for Owen and Claire, others came for Alan, Ellie, and Malcolm. Dominion has to satisfy both, and that's not easy. There are also several supporting performances that help fill out the world. Some leave strong impressions despite limited screen time. Others feel slightly underutilized, mostly because the movie already has so many people competing for attention. That's probably the recurring challenge throughout the cast. Not talent, screen time. There are simply too many characters for everyone to receive equal focus. Still, when I look back on the performances, the thing I remember most isn't any individual dramatic moment. It's the chemistry. The feeling that these characters belong in the same universe. The feeling that old relationships still matter. The feeling that, despite all the chaos happening around them, the human side of the story hasn't been completely lost. That's important because dinosaurs may sell the tickets, but characters are what make audiences care about what happens next. And while Dominion's cast doesn't always receive the strongest material, they do enough to remind us why these characters have remained part of the franchise for so long. Even after all these years, they still feel like part of the Jurassic world. This is probably the point where opinions about Dominion become the most divided, because once you move past the individual topics, the dinosaurs, the nostalgia, the action, the performances, you eventually arrive at a simple question. Is this actually a good movie? And strangely enough, the answer often depends on what you're looking for. If you're judging Dominion purely as a piece of storytelling, the conversation becomes complicated pretty quickly. The screenplay is crowded. The pacing is uneven. Several plot developments rely on coincidence. Some characters receive stronger material than others. Certain ideas feel underdeveloped, while others receive more attention than expected. These criticisms aren't difficult to find. Even many people who enjoyed the movie acknowledge them. But then there's the other side of the discussion, the experience, because watching a movie and analyzing a movie aren't always the same thing. There are films that work brilliantly on paper, but leave little impression once they're over. And there are films packed with flaws that audiences still enjoy spending time with. Dominion often falls into that second category. For many viewers, the movie succeeds simply because it delivers what they came to see: dinosaurs, adventure, escapes, chases, big set pieces, familiar characters, a large-scale blockbuster experience. The film rarely goes very long without providing some form of spectacle, and for a significant portion of the audience, that's enough. Not every movie needs to be a masterclass in storytelling to be entertaining. Sometimes people just want to sit down, watch prehistoric creatures cause chaos, and have a good time for a couple of hours. Dominion understands that audience exists. In fact, much of the movie feels designed specifically for them. That's one reason reactions vary so dramatically. Some viewers approach the film hoping for the emotional impact and narrative precision of the original Jurassic Park. Others approach it as a summer adventure where giant reptiles chase people around the world. Those are very different expectations, and Dominion satisfies them with very different levels of success. What's fascinating is that both groups are watching the exact same movie. They're simply evaluating different things. One person sees narrative flaws and leaves disappointed. Another sees blockbuster entertainment and leaves satisfied. Neither perspective is necessarily wrong. The movie genuinely contains elements that support both reactions. Personally, I think Dominion works best when it's viewed as an entertainment-first experience, not because the story doesn't matter. The story absolutely matters, but because the film's greatest strengths aren't found in its screenplay. They're found in its ability to create moments: a tense encounter, a nostalgic reunion, a thrilling chase, a spectacular dinosaur reveal, a crowd-pleasing payoff. Those moments are what many viewers remember. That's why the movie creates such an unusual split in opinion. People who prioritize storytelling often focus on what Dominion could have been. People who prioritize entertainment often focus on what it is. And somewhere between those two viewpoints lies the film itself, a movie filled with genuine flaws, a movie filled with genuine entertainment, a movie capable of frustrating you and entertaining you within the very same scene, which honestly might be the most accurate way to describe the entire experience. Dominion isn't a perfect story, but for many audiences, it remains an enjoyable ride. The question is whether the ride is enough for you. By the time a franchise reaches its sixth film, there's a question that becomes impossible to avoid. Does this series still have somewhere new to go? And honestly, Dominion spends a surprising amount of time forcing that question into the conversation. Not intentionally, perhaps, but it's there, because while watching the movie, you occasionally get the feeling that the Jurassic franchise is wrestling with its own history. Think about how long we've been doing this. Scientists bring dinosaurs back. Something goes wrong, people run, dinosaurs chase them. Human greed causes problems. Nature refuses to cooperate. The survivors escape. The cycle repeats. Now, that's an oversimplification, but only slightly. The challenge for Dominion is that audiences know the formula almost as well as the filmmakers do. We've seen parks fail. We've seen islands fail. We've seen corporations fail. We've seen scientists push too far. We've seen giant predators appear as the latest threat. After 3 decades, surprise becomes increasingly difficult. And to be fair, Dominion does try to expand beyond that formula. The dinosaurs are no longer confined to islands. The world has changed. The scale is larger. The themes are broader. The story reaches into new areas involving genetics, ecology, corporate influence, and global consequences. You can see the effort. You can see the ambition. The problem is that expansion isn't always the same thing as reinvention. Many of the movie's core mechanics still feel familiar. Characters are still escaping danger. Corporate villains are still making reckless decisions. The franchise is still revisiting some of the same themes it explored decades ago. That's where the idea of franchise fatigue starts creeping in, not because audiences are tired of dinosaurs. I don't think that's the issue at all. People clearly still love dinosaurs. The excitement hasn't disappeared. What some viewers seem tired of is repetition. The feeling that the franchise keeps circling the same territory instead of discovering genuinely new ground. And that's what makes Dominion such an interesting movie. At times, it feels like a franchise desperately trying to evolve. At other times, it feels like a franchise struggling to escape its own DNA. Both things can be true simultaneously. What's fascinating is that even the movie's strongest weapon, nostalgia, contributes to this discussion. Bringing back beloved characters creates excitement. But it also reminds audiences how heavily the series continues to rely on its past. Every callback is both a celebration and a reminder, a celebration of what worked before, a reminder that the franchise may still be searching for something equally powerful moving forward. That's why reactions to Dominion often feel larger than reactions to a single movie. People aren't only judging this film. They're judging 6 films, 3 decades, an entire franchise. Whether Dominion serves as a satisfying conclusion or simply another chapter depends on the viewer. But regardless of where you land, the movie highlights a reality every long-running series eventually faces. Survival isn't enough. At some point, evolution becomes necessary. The original Jurassic Park succeeded because it showed audiences something they had never seen before. The challenge facing every sequel since then has been finding a way to recreate that feeling. Dominion occasionally comes close, but it also reminds us just how difficult that challenge has become. Because after all these years, dinosaurs are still exciting. The real question is whether the franchise can still surprise us, and that's the question future Jurassic films will have to answer. So after everything, the dinosaurs, the returning cast, the corporate conspiracies, the giant locusts, the action scenes, the nostalgia, the spectacle, where does that leave Jurassic World, Dominion? Honestly, that's not an easy question to answer, because Dominion is one of those movies where your final opinion is heavily influenced by what you expected going in. If you were hoping for a film that would match the impact of the original Jurassic Park, there's a good chance you'll walk away disappointed. That's not really a criticism of Dominion specifically. It's simply the reality of the situation. Very few blockbuster films in history have managed to achieve what Jurassic Park achieved in 1993. Trying to recreate that lightning in a bottle nearly 30 years later was always going to be an impossible task. But Dominion isn't trying to be Jurassic Park, at least not entirely. It's trying to be a conclusion, a reunion. A celebration, a blockbuster adventure, a science fiction thriller, and sometimes perhaps too many things at once. That's where many of its strengths and weaknesses come from. The movie is ambitious, genuinely ambitious. You can feel it in almost every major decision. The larger scope, the expanded world, the multiple storylines, the returning legacy characters, the attempt to bring together every era of the franchise under one roof. Whether those ideas always work is another discussion, but the effort is visible. And honestly, I'd rather watch a movie that occasionally reaches too far than one that never attempts anything interesting at all. At the same time, it's impossible to ignore the flaws. The narrative can feel crowded. Certain ideas deserve more development. The pacing occasionally struggles under the weight of everything the film is trying to carry. And some of the most fascinating concepts introduced by the movie never receive the attention they probably deserve. Those issues matter. They prevent Dominion from becoming the definitive finale many fans hoped for. Yet despite all of that, I can't say the movie is devoid of entertainment. Far from it. There are exciting sequences, beautiful visuals, strong moments of suspense, enjoyable performances, and of course, dinosaurs. Lots of dinosaurs. The film never completely loses sight of the fact that people came here to be entertained. For some viewers, that will be enough. For others, it won't. And that's why Dominion remains such a divisive entry in the franchise. It's a movie filled with impressive highs and frustrating limitations. A movie that can feel surprisingly fun one moment and surprisingly messy the next. A movie that occasionally reaches greatness but rarely stays there for long. As for the future of Jurassic, that's where things become interesting, because Dominion feels less like a final ending and more like a crossroads. The movie proves there's still audience interest in this universe. The dinosaurs still work. The spectacle still works. The concept still has life. What remains uncertain is the direction. If future films continue relying on the same formulas, the franchise risks becoming trapped by its own history. But if filmmakers can find genuinely fresh ideas, new perspectives, and new ways to explore this world, there's still plenty of potential left. The dinosaurs were never the problem. The challenge has always been finding stories worthy of them, and that's ultimately what Dominion leaves behind. Not a perfect conclusion, not a disaster, something far more complicated. A reminder of why people fell in love with this franchise in the first place, and a reminder of how difficult it is to keep that sense of wonder alive decade after decade. Whether you leave the movie satisfied, disappointed, or somewhere in between, one thing is certain. Nearly 30 years later, we're still talking about Jurassic Park, and honestly, that's probably the strongest sign that this franchise still matters.